Welcome, fellow dreamer. Tonight, we journey through the timeless art of poetry, from the earliest epic verses sung by firelight to the passionate spoken word performances of today, tracing how poets across civilizations have woven language into beauty and meaning. This exploration unfolds accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, revealing hidden wonders and captivating stories from the world of verse. As you listen, let these gentle discoveries nourish your curiosity while guiding you softly toward restful sleep. So take a deep breath, settle into comfort, and allow your mind and eyes to rest. Let the story carry you through the landscapes of human expression as poets throughout the ages whisper their wisdom into the quiet of this peaceful evening. Long before humans invented writing, before the first symbols were scratched into clay or painted on cave walls, our ancestors discovered something magical about the way words could dance together. In the flickering light of ancient fires, beneath star-filled skies that seemed closer than they do today, people found that certain combinations of sounds had a special power. When words moved together in rhythm, when they repeated in patterns, when they rose and fell like waves on a distant shore, they became easier to remember. And in a world without books or scrolls, memory was everything. Imagine for a moment those earliest communities, living lives we can barely comprehend today. Every piece of knowledge that mattered for survival had to be carried in the mind and passed from one generation to the next through speech alone. Which plants could heal and which could harm, when to plant seeds and when to expect the rains. The stories of ancestors and the names of distant relatives, the paths through dangerous territories and the location of water sources that never ran dry. All of this precious information had to travel through time on nothing more substantial than human breath and human memory. This is where poetry was born, though those ancient people would not have called it by that name. They discovered that when words were arranged with rhythm and repetition, they stuck in the mind like burrs on clothing. A simple list of edible plants might be forgotten by the next day, but transform that same information into a chant with a steady beat. Add some rhyme or alliteration, and suddenly it could be recalled years later. The rhythm became a container for knowledge, and melody made that container easy to carry. In communities scattered across every continent, humans began creating these memorable patterns of speech for all the important moments and essential knowledge of their lives. When the seasons changed, they sang poems to mark the transformation. When someone was born or died, when a young person became an adult, when two people joined their lives together, poetry gave shape to these transitions. The rhythmic words created a sense of ceremony, transforming everyday moments into something that felt sacred and significant. We know this happened, though we can never hear those earliest poems. We know it from the echoes that remain in indigenous cultures around the world, in traditional songs and chants that have been passed down through countless generations. We know it from studying how memory works, how much easier it is to recall information when it arrives in rhythmic patterns. and we know it from the universal human impulse to make our words beautiful, to find patterns in sound that please the ear and satisfy something deep in our nature. Consider the harvest songs that surely must have existed whenever early farmers gathered their crops. After months of hoping and watching, when the grain finally stood ready to cut, or the fruit hung heavy on branches, imagine the collective joy of a community bringing in food that would sustain them through the cold months ahead. That joy needed expression, and simple shouts of happiness would not suffice. Instead, people created songs that everyone could sing together, words that moved in time with the physical labor of harvesting, creating a rhythm that made the work itself feel less burdensome. These were working songs and celebration songs simultaneously, poetry woven into the fabric of survival. The same patterns appeared in lullabies, perhaps among the oldest forms of poetry that exist. A parent soothing a restless child in the middle of the night would naturally begin to rock in a steady rhythm, and words would flow to match that rocking motion. Soft, repetitive sounds, gentle vowels, the same phrases returning like a promise that everything is safe and all is well. These lullabies cost nothing to create and nothing to preserve, yet they could be shared across an entire community, from parent to child, generation after generation. Tiny poems carrying not just words but love itself. Prehistoric peoples also created poetry to make sense of the world around them. When thunder crashed and lightning split the sky, when the ground shook beneath their feet, when someone fell ill with a mysterious fever, poetry provided a way to describe and perhaps influence these powerful forces. They crafted chants and invocations, rhythmic words that might persuade the spirits or gods they believed controlled such things. Whether these poems had any practical effect on the world is less important than what they did for the people who spoke them. Poetry gave humans a sense of agency, a feeling that words could be powerful tools, not just for communication but for shaping reality itself. The repetition so central to early poetry served multiple purposes. It made the words easier to learn and recall, certainly, but it also created a kind of trance-like state in both speaker and listener. When the same phrases return again and again, when the rhythm becomes as steady as a heartbeat, consciousness shifts subtly. Time seems to slow. The ordinary world recedes slightly, and the words take on an intensity they might not otherwise possess. This quality made poetry perfect for ceremonies and rituals, those special times when communities gathered to acknowledge something beyond the everyday. As human societies grew more complex, so did their poetry. Longer narrative poems emerged, telling the stories of great hunts or memorable journeys, celebrating heroes and cautioning against dangers. These story poems became the entertainment of long winter evenings, the shared culture that bound communities together. A skilled storyteller who could recite a long narrative poem from memory became a valuable member of society, a keeper of tradition and history, someone who could make the past feel present and immediate. In some cultures, certain individuals became recognized as specialists in creating and performing these memorable word patterns. They might have been called by different names in different places and times, but they served similar functions. They were the ones with the gift for crafting phrases that resonated, for finding the perfect word to complete a pattern, for sensing what rhythms would carry their audiences along. They were, in essence, the world's first poets, though they lived and died thousands of years before anyone would write the word poetry. And so poetry emerged not as an art form distinct from daily life, but as an essential tool woven into the fabric of human existence. It was how knowledge survived, how ceremonies gained power, how communities created shared identity, and how individuals expressed the emotions that all humans feel. Every culture developed its own poetic traditions, its own preferred rhythms and patterns, yet the impulse was universal. Wherever humans lived, they made poetry, because poetry served needs that simple prose could not. As thousands of years passed, and human civilizations began to develop, as people settled in river valleys and built the first cities, as they discovered metallurgy and agriculture became more sophisticated, they carried their poetic traditions with them. And when writing was finally invented in those ancient places, one of the first things humans chose to write down were the poems they had been carrying in their memories all along. The age of written poetry was about to begin, and the story continues in the ancient land between two rivers, where scribes would press the shapes of an epic tale into soft clay tablets. As humanity's first songs echoed through the darkness of prehistory, something remarkable was beginning to unfold in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In ancient Mesopotamia, where irrigation channels brought life to thirsty fields and cities rose from the earth like man-made mountains, poets were creating something the world had never seen before. They were taking the ancient art of storytelling and preserving it in a new medium, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay that would harden and endure for thousands of years. The story begins in Sumer, where sometime around 4,000 years ago, scribes sat in temple courtyards and palace rooms, carefully forming cuneiform signs on clay tablets. These weren't simple records of grain stores or tax collections, though the Sumerians certainly kept those as well. These were verses, carefully structured lines that told of gods and heroes, of friendship and loss, of humanity's eternal questions about life and death. Among all the clay fragments and tablets that archaeologists have pieced together from ancient Mesopotamia, one story stands above the rest. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerges from the ancient world like a voice speaking directly across millennia, telling us that the concerns of people 4,000 years ago were remarkably similar to our own. The poem tells of a king of Uruk, a powerful ruler named Gilgamesh, who was part god and part human, blessed with extraordinary strength and cursed with mortal limitations. The scribes who composed and copied this epic were doing something revolutionary. They were taking stories that had likely been passed down through generations of spoken word, tales told by firelight and in palace halls, and they were fixing them in permanent form. The very act of writing poetry changed how poets thought about their craft. Words could now be revised, reconsidered, and perfected in ways that spontaneous speech never allowed. The Epic of Gilgamesh follows its hero through adventures that would become templates for storytelling throughout the ages. We meet Gilgamesh as a restless king, so powerful and demanding that that his people cry out to the gods for relief. The gods create Enkidu, a wild man who lives among animals, to be Gilgamesh's equal and companion. After a fierce contest, the two become devoted friends, and their friendship forms the emotional heart of the epic. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey to the cedar forest to battle Humbaba, its supernatural guardian. They travel not for conquest or treasure in the usual sense, but for glory and lasting fame. The poet understood something profound about human nature, that we seek to leave our mark on the world, to be remembered after we're gone. When Enkidu eventually dies, Gilgamesh's grief transforms him. The mighty king who feared nothing suddenly confronts the reality that he too will die. What follows is perhaps the most moving part of the epic. Gilgamesh, devastated by his friend's death and terrified of his own mortality, sets out on a quest to find Utnapishtim, the one human who had been granted eternal life by the gods. The journey takes Gilgamesh through darkness and across waters of death, through landscapes both real and mythological. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, he hears a story within the story, an account of a great flood that destroyed the world, from which only Utnapishtim and his family survived in a boat. This flood story, embedded in the Gilgamesh epic, predates other famous flood narratives and shows how certain themes echoed through ancient Middle Eastern cultures. The Mesopotamian poets were drawing on shared memories and common stories, weaving them into their verses with skill and purpose. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that immortality was a unique gift, not something that can be achieved through strength or determination. Yet he offers the king a chance to obtain a plant that restores youth, growing at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives deep and retrieves this precious plant, planning to bring it back to Uruk to share with his people. But in a moment of tragic irony, while Gilgamesh bathes in a cool pool during his journey home, a serpent smells the plant's sweetness and steals it away, shedding its skin and becoming young again. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, but transformed by his journey. The epic ends with the king looking upon the walls of his city, finding meaning not in immortality, but in the lasting works he has created, the civilization he has built. The poets who shaped this story made deliberate choices in how they told it. They used repetition, a technique that helped memory and created a sense of ritual significance. Certain phrases appear again and again throughout the epic, like waves returning to shore. When Gilgamesh mourns Enkidu, his lament repeats with the variations, each repetition adding weight to his sorrow. The structure of the verses follows patterns, rhythms that would have made the epic easier to remember and more powerful to hear. Mesopotamian scribes didn't simply record one version of these stories. Multiple versions of the Gilgamesh epic existed across different cities and time periods. Some tablets contain earlier Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that were later incorporated into the longer Akkadian epic. Scribes in different cities added their own flourishes, emphasized different episodes, and adapted the story for their audiences. This wasn't seen as corrupting the text, but rather as participating in a living tradition. The clay tablets themselves tell us about the working lives of ancient poets and scribes. Some tablets bear the names of the scribes who wrote them, men who spent years learning the complex cuneiform script and the traditional forms of poetry. In some cases, we can see corrections and revisions, places where a scribe reconsidered a word choice or fixed an error. These humble signs of human imperfection make the ancient poets feel somehow closer, more real. Beyond Gilgamesh, Mesopotamian literature includes countless other poetic works. There were hymns to gods and goddesses, each deity praised in verses that described their powers and beseeched their favor. There were laments for destroyed cities, powerful poems mourning the fall of Ur and other once great urban centers. These laments follow strict forms, building their emotional power through repetition and structured grief. The Mesopotamian poets established patterns that would echo through poetry for millennia to come. They understood how to build a narrative arc, how to use parallel structure for emphasis, how to balance action with reflection. They knew that poetry could explore the biggest questions, life and death and meaning, while also telling gripping stories of adventure and emotion. When we read their works today, painstakingly translated from those ancient clay tablets, we recognize something familiar in their concerns and in their artistry. As these clay tablets multiplied in Mesopotamian libraries and archives, poetry was becoming something new, something that could travel through time with remarkable fidelity, waiting in the earth to speak to future generations who would uncover and decipher them, finding in their verses the voices of humanity's early storytellers. As the great civilizations of Mesopotamia were carving their epic tales into clay tablets, another ancient culture along the fertile banks of the Nile was developing its own remarkable poetic tradition. The poets of ancient Egypt would create verses that ranged from solemn pyramid texts meant to guide pharaohs through the afterlife to tender love songs that could have been written yesterday. Their words, preserved on papyrus scrolls and carved into temple walls, reveal a civilization that understood poetry's power to connect the earthly and the divine, the eternal and the fleeting. The earliest Egyptian poetry we can still read today comes from the walls of pyramids themselves. These pyramid texts, inscribed during the Old Kingdom around 2400 BCE, represent some of humanity's oldest religious poetry. Imagine priests chanting these carefully structured verses in dimly lit burial chambers, their words echoing off stone walls as they performed rituals to ensure the deceased pharaoh's safe journey to the realm of the gods. The verses were not random prayers, but meticulously crafted poetry with parallel structures and repetitions that made them easier to remember and more powerful in their delivery. They spoke of transformation, of the pharaoh becoming one with the sun god Ra, sailing across the sky in a celestial boat. The imagery was vivid and strange to modern ears. The pharaoh climbs a ladder made of sunbeams or transforms into a bird to fly among the stars. As Egyptian civilization flourished through the Middle Kingdom and into the New Kingdom, poetry expanded beyond the walls of tombs. Scribes, those privileged few who mastered the complex system of hieroglyphic writing, began recording poems on papyrus, a writing material made from reeds that grew abundantly along the Nile. These papyrus scrolls have survived in Egypt's dry climate, offering us windows into the hearts and minds of people who lived thousands of years ago. The Egyptians developed a sophisticated approach to verse structure. They often used couplets, where thoughts were expressed in pairs of lines that balanced and complemented each other. Sometimes the second line would repeat the idea of the first in different words, a technique that created a gentle rhythmic quality when the poems were spoken or sung. This parallelism, as scholars call it, gave Egyptian poetry a meditative, almost wave-like quality, like the Nile itself flowing steadily through the desert. Hymns to the gods formed a major category of Egyptian poetry. These weren't dry, formal recitations, but passionate celebrations of divine power and beauty. One of the most famous is the great hymn to the Aten, composed during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BCE. This extraordinary poem praises the sun disk, the Aten, as the sole creator and sustainer of all life. The poet describes how the sun's rising brings the world to life each morning. Birds take flight, fish leap in the river, plants open their leaves, and people wake to begin their work. When the sun sets, the world sleeps, vulnerable and still waiting for dawn's return. The poem's imagery is so universal and moving that some scholars have noted similarities to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible, suggesting that Egypt's poetic traditions may have influenced neighboring cultures. But Egyptian poetry wasn't only concerned with gods and pharaohs. Among the most delightful discoveries in Egyptian literature are the love poems, which reveal that people in ancient times experienced romance with the same intensity and complexity as people do today. These poems, collected on papyri from the New Kingdom period, speak with surprising intimacy and tenderness. Young lovers call each other brother and sister, terms of endearment rather than literal kinship. The poems describe the physical beauty of the beloved, the ache of separation, the joy of being together. In one poem, a young woman describes how her heart races when she sees her beloved, how she trembles and cannot eat. In another, a young man compares his beloved to precious things, to gold, to lapis lazuli, to the finest perfumes. These poets understood metaphor and used the natural world around them to express emotion. Gardens become settings for secret meetings. The Nile breeze carries messages between lovers. Date palms and sycamore trees witness whispered conversations. Some of these love poems are remarkably playful. In one sequence, a young woman pretends to be ill so she can see the young physician who has captured her heart. In another, lovers exchange poems like messages, each responding to the other's words. The frankness with which these ancient poets describe desire and longing might surprise those who imagine ancient civilizations as always formal and restrained. Egyptian love poetry reveals that the experience of falling in love, with all its confusion and delight, has remained remarkably constant across the millennia. Egyptian poets also created works that we might call wisdom literature, poems that offered guidance for living well. These often took the form of instructions, supposedly from a father to his son, or from a sage to his students. They advised moderation, honesty, respect for others, and careful speech. While more didactic than some poetry, these works still employed poetic techniques, memorable phrases, vivid examples, and rhythmic language that made the teachings easier to retain. The Egyptians believed deeply in ma'at, a concept that encompassed truth, justice, harmony, and proper order. Poetry served as one way to maintain and celebrate ma'at. When poets praised the pharaoh, they emphasized his role in upholding ma'at. When they honored the gods, they acknowledged the divine source of cosmic order. Even love poetry, with its celebrations of beauty and connection, reflected the Egyptian appreciation for harmony and balance. Throughout ancient Egyptian history, which stretched across 3,000 years, poetry remained central to religious practice, royal ceremony, and personal expression. Poems were sung at festivals, recited at banquets, performed in temples, and copied by students learning the scribal arts. The best poems were preserved and recopied generation after generation, suggesting that the Egyptians recognized exceptional poetic craftsmanship and valued it enough to ensure its survival. The physical beauty of Egyptian poetry was enhanced by the writing system itself. Hieroglyphs, those elegant symbols of birds and eyes and water and bread loaves, transformed written poems into visual art. A poem inscribed on a temple wall or painted on a tomb ceiling became something to see as well as to hear. A synthesis of visual and verbal beauty that few other cultures have achieved so completely. As we move forward in our journey through poetry's long history, we'll find that many traditions the Egyptians established continued in later cultures. The use of parallelism, the praise of divine powers through nature imagery, the frank expression of desire in love poetry, the preservation of wisdom through verse, all these would reappear in different forms across different times and places. The ancient Egyptian poets, writing on papyrus and stone along the life-giving Nile, had discovered fundamental ways that language could be shaped into something memorable, beautiful, and true. As we leave behind the papyrus scrolls and temple walls of ancient Egypt, we journey eastward across vast distances to the Indian subcontinent, where an extraordinary poetic tradition was already flourishing in ways that would influence literature and thought for thousands of years to come. The poetry of ancient India represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in combining linguistic beauty with philosophical depth, creating verses that were designed not merely to please the ear, but to transform the very consciousness of those who heard them. Long before the Great Pyramids rose along the Nile, nomadic peoples moved across the plains and mountains of northern India, bringing with them sacred hymns that had been preserved through countless generations. These verses, known as the Vedas, were composed in Sanskrit, a language whose very name means perfectly formed or refined. The Vedic hymns emerged from a time when memory was the only library, when the survival of knowledge depended entirely on the human voice carrying wisdom from one generation to the next. The oldest of these collections, the Rig Veda, contains more than 1,000 hymns directed toward various deities and natural forces. Picture priests gathering at dawn, their voices rising in carefully measured rhythms as they honored Agni, the god of fire, or Indra, the wielder of thunderbolts. These weren't simple prayers, but intricate compositions that employed elaborate metaphors and asked profound questions about existence itself. One famous hymn, the Nasadiya Sukta, contemplates the very origin of creation with a philosophical sophistication that still resonates today, wondering whether even the gods knew how the universe began. What made these Vedic compositions truly remarkable was the precision with which they were transmitted. The ancient Indian poets developed an astonishingly sophisticated understanding of phonetics and metrics. They didn't simply recite verses. They created exact systems for pronunciation, pitch, and duration of syllables. Every sound had to be perfect because these hymns were considered sacred, their power residing not just in their meaning, but in their very sound patterns. Families of priests devoted their entire lives to preserving these verses with such accuracy that modern scholars marvel at how texts remained virtually unchanged across millennia. The metrical systems these early poets developed became foundations for all subsequent Sanskrit poetry. They identified patterns of heavy and light syllables, creating rhythmic structures of remarkable complexity. Unlike poetry in many other traditions that relied primarily on rhyme or simple repetition, Sanskrit verse was built on intricate arrangements of syllabic weight and timing, producing a musical quality that made even philosophical concepts feel like song. As Indian civilization evolved, so too did its poetry. By the time the great epic period began, roughly between 400 BCE and 400 CE, poets were creating narratives of breathtaking scope and ambition. The Mahabharata stands as the longest epic poem ever composed, containing roughly 100,000 couplets woven into 18 books. To put this in perspective, it's about 10 times the combined length of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This immense work tells the story of two families, the Pandavas and Kauravas, locked in a dynastic struggle that culminates in a catastrophic war. But within this narrative framework, the Mahabharata encompasses countless digressions into philosophy, law, politics, and spirituality. The poet Vyasa, to whom the epic is traditionally attributed, created not just a story, but an entire universe of thought. Characters pause mid-journey to discuss duty and righteousness. Warriors on the battlefield debate the nature of time and destiny. One section, the Bhagavad Gita, presents a dialogue between the warrior Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna about dharma, or proper conduct, that has become one of the world's most influential philosophical poems. The poetry of the Mahabharata flows in a meter called Anushtubh, with each verse containing 32 syllables arranged in 4 quarters. This rhythm became so natural to Sanskrit composition that it served as the standard epic meter for centuries. Listening to these verses, one can almost hear the ancient poets finding their cadence, letting the meter carry both action-packed battle scenes and quiet moments of reflection with equal grace. The other great Sanskrit epic, the Ramayana, presents a more focused narrative while maintaining similar philosophical depth. Traditionally attributed to the poet Valmiki, this work tells the story of Prince Rama, his wife Sita, and his loyal companion Hanuman. The poetry here takes on a different quality, often more ornate and emotionally vivid than the Mahabharata. Valmiki is said to have invented the shloka meter after witnessing a hunter kill one of two mating birds, his grief spontaneously forming into verse. Whether this origin story is historical or legendary, it speaks to how Sanskrit poets understood their craft as emerging from deep emotional experience. The Ramayana's verses paint scenes with remarkable visual clarity. Descriptions of forests teem with specific details about trees, flowers, and wildlife. Palaces gleam with precise architectural features. When Sita is abducted, the poetry conveys her anguish through natural imagery, comparing her tears to lotus petals touched by dew. The demon king Ravana isn't simply evil, but complex. His terrible actions emerging from pride and desire that the poetry renders with psychological nuance. Beyond these two monumental epics, Sanskrit poets developed classical forms that refined the language's poetic possibilities even further. The Mahakavya, or classical epic, became a distinct genre with its own conventions. Poets like Kalidasa, who lived sometime around the 4th or 5th century CE, brought unprecedented elegance to Sanskrit verse. His work, Meghaduta, or The Cloud Messenger, tells of an exiled spirit who asks a passing cloud to carry a message to his distant beloved. The entire poem is an extended address to this cloud, describing the landscape it will cross with such beauty that geography becomes emotion, each mountain and river marking the distance between separated lovers. Kalidasa's poetry demonstrates how Sanskrit could compress tremendous meaning into compact phrases. The language's system of compound words allowed poets to create intricate images within a single term. A sunset might be described with a compound that simultaneously evokes color, movement, divine presence, and emotional atmosphere. Translation can barely capture this density, but even in other languages, one senses the careful architecture of thought and feeling in each verse. Sanskrit poets also explored drama through verse, creating plays where different characters spoke in different meters and dialects, revealing their social status and emotional states through poetic form itself. They wrote love poetry of extraordinary sensuality and philosophical poems that used natural phenomena as metaphors for spiritual truths. They developed detailed theories of poetics, analyzing how language creates rasa, the emotional essence that poetry should evoke in its audience. As we prepare to leave ancient India and journey westward to ancient Greece, we carry with us an understanding of how one culture made poetry central to its entire intellectual and spiritual life. The Sanskrit tradition showed how verse could preserve sacred knowledge, tell stories that contained multitudes, explore the subtlest shadings of human emotion, and investigate the deepest questions of existence. These ancient Indian poets didn't simply write. They crafted language into an instrument for exploring every dimension of consciousness, creating a legacy that continues to resonate through the centuries. As we leave behind the ancient poetic traditions of India and turn our attention westward, we find ourselves approaching the shores of the Mediterranean, where a poet whose very name has become synonymous with storytelling awaits us. In the centuries around 800 years before the Common Era, in the Greek-speaking world, poetry was about to take a form so powerful, so enduring, that its influence would echo through every generation that followed. The poet we call Homer stands at the threshold of Western literature like a colossus, though the details of his life remain wrapped in mystery. Some ancient sources claimed he was blind, wandering from place to place, reciting his verses to audiences gathered in flickering firelight. Others wondered whether Homer was even a single person, or perhaps a name given to a tradition of poets who shaped and reshaped the same stories over generations. What we can say with certainty is that the poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, represent a pinnacle of poetic achievement that transformed how stories could be told. These epic poems were composed in a meter called dactylic hexameter, a rhythm that flows like waves against a shore. Each line contains 6 metrical feet, creating a rolling, hypnotic pattern that made the verses easier to remember and beautiful to hear. This wasn't poetry meant for silent reading on a page. These were performances, recitations that could last for hours or even days, holding audiences spellbound as professional reciters, called rhapsodes, brought the words to life with gesture and vocal variation. The Iliad takes us to the beaches of Troy, where Greek warriors have laid siege to that great city for nearly a decade. But Homer's genius lies not in describing every battle or cataloguing every hero. Instead, he focuses on a brief period near the war's end, exploring the rage of Achilles, the greatest of Greek warriors, and the consequences that ripple outward from his anger. Through this lens, Homer examines pride, honor, friendship, and mortality itself. When Achilles finally confronts the Trojan prince Hector, we witness not just a combat between enemies, but a meditation on the choices that define us and the fate that awaits all mortals, no matter how great their strength or noble their birth. The Odyssey follows the long journey home of Odysseus, another Greek hero, as he spends 10 years trying to return to his island kingdom of Ithaca after the fall of Troy. Through his encounters with monsters, enchantresses, and hostile gods, Homer creates something remarkable. A hero defined not primarily by physical strength, but by cleverness, endurance, and an unwavering determination to return home. The poem weaves together adventure and domesticity, the fantastic and the familiar, creating a narrative structure that would influence countless stories to come. What made these poems so extraordinary was not just their stories, but how they told them. Homer developed techniques that would become fundamental to poetic craft. He used extended similes, comparing a warrior's charge to a lion attacking a herd, or the clash of armies to trees falling in a storm. These comparisons slowed the narrative at crucial moments, allowing listeners to see and feel the action more vividly. He gave each major character distinctive ways of speaking, so audiences could recognize personalities through voice alone. And he created formulaic phrases, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, swift-footed Achilles, that served both practical purposes for memorization and poetic purposes for establishing mood and character. The ancient Greeks themselves regarded these poems as foundational to their culture. Children memorized passages as part of their education. Philosophers debated the ethics of Homer's characters. Artists painted scenes from the epics on pottery and walls. The poems provided a shared cultural reference point, a common story that helped diverse city-states scattered across the Mediterranean, feel connected to something larger than themselves. Following Homer, Greek poetry continued to evolve and flourish. The epic tradition found new expression in works like Hesiod's poems, which organized knowledge about the god, and about farming into verse form. Hesiod's Theogony told the story of how the gods came to be, creating a systematic mythology from older, scattered traditions. His works and days offered practical advice about agriculture and ethics, proving that poetry could teach and instruct while still maintaining its artistic qualities. The Greeks developed theatre as a poetic form, with tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides creating plays entirely in verse. These weren't simply stories performed on stage. They were complex poetic compositions that explored profound questions about justice, fate, family, and the relationship between humans and the divine. In the plays of these masters, poetry became a vehicle for examining the most difficult aspects of human existence, forcing audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about their own natures and societies. Greek comedy, too, found expression in poetry, with playwrights like Aristophanes using verse to create works of biting social satire and absurd humor. The fact that even comedy was composed in carefully structured poetic forms reveals how deeply poetry was woven into Greek culture. It wasn't reserved only for serious or elevated subjects. Poetry was simply the natural medium for expression across all aspects of life. The Greeks understood poetry as a gift from the Muses, those divine daughters of memory who inspired human creativity. Poets often began their works by invoking a muse, asking for divine assistance in telling their tales. This wasn't mere convention. It reflected a genuine belief that poetry connected the human and divine realms, that through the right arrangement of words in rhythm and meter, something transcendent could occur. This reverence for poetry shaped Greek education and values. To be cultured meant knowing poetry. To be educated meant having memorized substantial portions of Homer and other poets. Poetry served as history, teaching Greeks about their past. It served as ethics, providing models of behavior to emulate or avoid. It served as entertainment, giving pleasure through the beauty of language and story. And it served as a kind of collective memory, preserving in memorable form the knowledge and values that defined Greek civilization. The influence of these Greek poetic traditions would extend far beyond the ancient world. When Romans encountered Greek culture, they found in these poems a standard to admire and emulate. When medieval monks preserved ancient texts, they ensured these poems would survive to inspire new generations. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered classical learning, Greek poetry provided models for their own creative efforts. Even today, we still tell stories shaped by patterns Homer established nearly 3,000 years ago. As we prepare to move forward into the next phase of our journey through poetry's story, where we'll encounter the more personal, intimate voices of Greek lyric poets, it's worth pausing to appreciate what these epic poets achieved. They took the raw materials of language, myth, and human experience, and through the crucible of poetic form created works that have outlasted empires, survived the collapse of civilizations, and continue to speak to something essential in the human spirit. In the rhythm of their verses, we hear echoes of our own questions, our own struggles, our own hopes for meaning in a vast and often mysterious world. As the great epic traditions established their firm foundations across the ancient Greek world, something remarkable began to happen. Poets started to step away from the grand narratives of heroes and gods, turning instead towards something more intimate and immediate. They began to write about themselves, about their own hearts and experiences, about the fleeting moments that made up individual lives. This was the birth of lyric poetry, a form that would forever change how human beings expressed their inner worlds. The term lyric comes from the lyre, that elegant stringed instrument that accompanied these verses when they were performed. Unlike the epic poems that were chanted or recited at length, these shorter poems were sung, their words dancing alongside melodies that enhanced their emotional power. The lyric poets created verses meant to be experienced in the moment, capturing feelings and observations that might last only as long as a summer afternoon or a sudden pang of longing. Among these voices, one stands out with particular clarity across the millennia. Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos around 600 BCE, created poetry of such beauty and emotional honesty that even the fragmentary remains of her work continue to move readers today. While we possess only portions of her original 9 books of verse, what survives reveals a poet of extraordinary skill and sensitivity. Sappho wrote primarily about love, desire, and the relationships between women in her community. Her poems captured the physical sensations of attraction with startling directness. When she described seeing someone she loved, she wrote of trembling, of speechlessness, of fire running beneath her skin. These were not abstract declarations, but visceral descriptions of what the body feels when overcome by emotion. She elevated personal experience to the level of art, showing that individual feelings deserve the same careful attention that epic poets had devoted to battlefield valor. Her technical mastery matched her emotional intelligence. She worked in a distinctive meter that came to bear her name, the Sapphic stanza, with its particular pattern of long and short syllables, creating a rhythm that felt both natural and formally precise. Other Greek poets would adopt this form, but none would use it with quite the same delicate power. In later centuries, philosophers would praise Sappho as the 10th muse, placing her alongside the divine inspirations of poetry itself. This recognition speaks to how deeply her work resonated, how completely she demonstrated that poetry could illuminate the private heart as compellingly as it had once illuminated the great events of myth and history. While Sappho explored the landscape of personal emotion, another poet named Pindar took lyric poetry in a different direction. Born near Thebes around 518 BCE, Pindar became famous for his victory odes, poems commissioned to celebrate athletes who had won at the great games held throughout Greece. These competitions at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and elsewhere were sacred occasions, and winning them brought honor not just to the athlete, but to their entire city. Pindar's odes transformed these athletic achievements into something approaching the mythological. He would begin with the victory itself, then weave in stories of gods and heroes, connecting the modern champion to the great figures of the past. His language soared and swooped with astonishing complexity, mixing vivid imagery with philosophical reflection. Reading Pindar requires close attention as he moves swiftly between different ideas and scenes, trusting his audience to follow his leaps of thought and imagination. What makes Pindar particularly fascinating is how he balanced praise with deeper meaning. Yes, he celebrated the winners who paid him, but he also used these occasions to meditate on fate, mortality, and the proper relationship between human achievement and divine favor. He reminded his listeners that even the greatest champions were still mortal, that glory itself was fleeting, and that true excellence required not just physical skill, but also wisdom and respect for the gods. His poems were performed by choruses, groups of singers who moved in elaborate patterns while delivering his complex verses. The word strophe that we still use in poetry comes from these performances, referring to the turn the chorus would make while singing. The physical movement and musical accompaniment added layers of meaning to words that were already dense with significance. Then there was Anacreon, who lived in the 6th century BCE and took yet another approach to lyric poetry. His verses celebrated the pleasures of the moment, the joy of wine, the beauty of youth, and the delights of celebration. Where Sappho wrote with intense emotional focus and Pindar with elevated grandeur, Anacreon adopted a lighter, more playful tone. His poems were shorter, their language simpler and more accessible, their message an invitation to enjoy life's pleasures while they lasted. Anacreon's influence would prove particularly strong in later periods when poets across Europe would imitate his style and themes. The very word anacreontic came to describe poetry that celebrated wine and merriment. Yet beneath his apparently carefree verses lay a clear awareness of time's passage and mortality's approach. His calls to celebrate today carried with them the implicit understanding that tomorrow might bring less joy. Other lyric poets contributed their own distinctive voices to this flowering of personal expression. Alcaeus, another poet from Lesbos and a contemporary of Sappho, wrote drinking songs and political poems, combining personal perspective with commentary on the turbulent events of his time. Simonides of Chios created epitaphs of remarkable concision and power, including the famous lines memorializing the Spartans who died at Thermopylae. These lyric poets established something that seems obvious to us now, but was revolutionary in their time: the idea that individual experience and personal emotion were worthy subjects for serious art. They showed that poetry need not always deal with gods and heroes, that it could instead turn its attention to what the ancient Greeks called the pathemathos, the knowledge that comes through suffering and feeling, through living a human life with all its joys and sorrows. Their work also demonstrated poetry's remarkable range. Within the space of just a few generations, Greek poets had developed forms for epic narrative, choral performance, victory celebration, love songs, drinking verses, and political commentary. They had shown that poetic craft could be applied to nearly any subject, that the formal discipline of meter and structure could enhance rather than constrain expression. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine the sound of a lyre accompanying a voice singing Sappho's verses, Or picture a chorus performing Pindar's elaborate odes in a sanctuary after the games. These poets gave us permission to value our inner lives, to find in our own experiences material worthy of art. They taught us that poetry need not be distant or impersonal, that it could speak directly from one human heart to another across the centuries. As Greek poetry flourished and evolved through the lyric voices we've encountered, a new power was rising across the Mediterranean Sea. Rome, at first a modest collection of settlements on 7 hills beside the Tiber River, would eventually command an empire stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Near East. And as Roman legions marched across the ancient world, Roman poets were creating works that would echo through the centuries just as powerfully as any military conquest. The Romans were, by their own admission, deeply indebted to Greek culture. Educated Romans learned Greek as naturally as their native Latin. They studied Homer and Sappho, absorbing the rhythms and techniques of Greek verb. Yet Roman poetry was never merely imitation. The poets of Rome took what they learned from Greece and transformed it, adding their own sensibilities, their own concerns, their own distinctive voice to the tradition they inherited. In the tumultuous final decades of the Roman Republic, poetry became an art form that reflected the tensions and transformations of the age. The poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, brought unprecedented intimacy and emotional rawness to Latin verse. Drawing inspiration from Greek lyric poets, he crafted poems that moved from tender declarations of love to bitter invectives against rivals and former friends. His verses captured the sophisticated urban culture of Rome, where poets gathered in small circles, sharing their work and refining their craft. Catullus wrote of passion with an intensity that still resonates, praising the object of his affection in one moment and condemning that same person in the next, his emotions swinging like a pendulum across the page. As the Republic gave way to empire under Augustus, poetry found new purposes and new patrons. The emperor himself recognized the power of verse to shape public opinion and create lasting monuments, more enduring than marble. Among the poets who flourished in this Augustan age, none stood taller than Virgil, whose works would define Latin poetry for generations. Virgil spent years composing his masterpiece, the Aeneid, an epic that told the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escaped the burning ruins of Troy and journeyed across the Mediterranean to Italy, where his descendants would found Rome. The poem was, on one level, a national epic designed to glorify Rome's origins and celebrate Augustus's rule. Yet Virgil infused his work with profound humanity, exploring themes of duty, loss, and the terrible costs of building civilization. His hero Aeneas is no simple warrior, but a man torn between personal desire and historical destiny, carrying his elderly father from burning Troy while leading his people toward an uncertain future. Working in the grand tradition of Homer, Virgil crafted verses in Latin hexameter, a rhythm that flowed naturally in his language, creating lines of remarkable beauty and power. He populated his epic with gods and mortals, prophecies and battles, love and tragedy. His 4th book, telling of Aeneas's doomed love affair with Dido, Queen of Carthage, became one of the most celebrated sections of ancient poetry, a story of passion sacrificed to duty that moved readers to tears for centuries afterward. Virgil had also composed pastoral poetry earlier in his career, creating idealized visions of rural life in his eclogues, where shepherds sang sophisticated verses to one another in peaceful countryside settings. These poems established a tradition of pastoral verse that would influence European poetry for thousands of years, offering readers an escape to imagined worlds of simplicity and natural beauty. Contemporary with Virgil was Horace, a poet of different temperament and style. Where Virgil composed grand epics and pastoral idylls, Horace perfected shorter forms, writing odes and satires that explored philosophy, friendship, and the art of living well. He had fought on the losing side in Rome's civil wars, yet found favor under Augustus, and created poetry that balanced praise for the emperor with personal reflection and gentle humor. Horace's odes adapted Greek lyric meters to Latin verse, creating poems of exquisite craftsmanship. He wrote about the passage of time, the importance of moderation, the pleasures of simple living, and the immortality that poetry could bestow. His phrase, carpe diem, urging readers to seize the day, has resonated across millennia. His verses possessed a conversational quality, as if he were speaking directly to the reader, sharing wisdom gained from experience without pretension or pomposity. The poet Ovid brought yet another dimension to Roman verse. Younger than Virgil and Horace, Ovid possessed a playful, irreverent spirit and an extraordinary gift for storytelling. His Metamorphoses, an epic poem in 15 books, wove together hundreds of myths from Greek and Roman tradition, all connected by the theme of transformation. Gods became animals. Humans turned into trees or stars. Love transformed people in countless ways. Ovid told these stories with wit, elegance, and psychological insight, creating a mythological encyclopedia in verse that became one of the most influential works in Western literature. Ovid also wrote poetry about love with a sophistication and self-awareness that was entirely his own. His art of love offered advice on romance with tongue firmly in cheek, treating seduction as a skill that could be learned and refined. This playful approach eventually contributed to his downfall. Augustus, attempting to promote traditional values in Rome, found Ovid's verses too subversive. The emperor exiled the poet to a remote town on the Black Sea, far from the sophisticated Roman society Ovid loved. From exile, Ovid wrote mournful verses lamenting his fate, describing the harsh landscape and longing for Rome, creating poetry of loss and displacement that added new emotional registers to Latin verse. These Roman poets wrote during times of profound change, as their world transformed from republic to empire, from city-state to Mediterranean-spanning dominion. Their poetry reflected these transformations, while also creating works that transcended their immediate historical moment. They explored universal human experiences, love and loss, duty and desire, the search for meaning, and the certainty of mortality, in language of enduring beauty. Latin poetry would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed. Later poets would write about daily life in Rome, about gladiatorial games and urban scenes, about philosophy and natural history. The tradition these Augustan masters established became the foundation for European poetry throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Students learning Latin would memorize their verses, absorbing their rhythms and techniques, their ways of seeing and saying. As we leave the Roman world behind, we carry with us these voices that sang of empire and emotion, of gods and mortals, of transformation and time. The poetry of Rome adapted what came before, while creating something distinctly new, just as poets have always done. And as Roman influence spread across Europe, Asia, and Africa, poetry was flourishing in lands far to the east, developing along entirely different paths, creating traditions that would prove equally enduring and influential in shaping human expression. As the Roman Empire extended its influence across much of the known Western world, a civilization of equal sophistication flourished far to the east, developing its own remarkable poetic traditions. In ancient China, poetry was not merely an art form reserved for special occasions or professional bards. It became woven into the very fabric of educated life, an essential skill for scholars, officials, and anyone who aspired to participate fully in the cultural conversation of their society. The earliest collection of Chinese poetry, known as the Shi Jing or Book of Songs, gathered together verses from as far back as the 11th century before the Common Era. These 305 poems came from diverse sources across the ancient Chinese landscape. Some were folk songs sung by farmers and common people, celebrating harvests, expressing the longings of separated lovers, or marking the seasons as they turned. Others were court compositions, elegant verses performed at state ceremonies, or created to honor noble ancestors. Still others were hymns sung in temples, connecting the human world with the divine. What made these early Chinese poems distinctive was their connection to music and the natural world. The verses followed simple patterns, often with 4 characters per line, creating a rhythm that matched the pace of breathing and the flow of speech. Poets drew their imagery from the landscape around them, rivers and mountains, birds and flowering trees, the moon rising over distant hills. This close observation of nature would become one of the defining characteristics of Chinese poetry through the centuries that followed. The philosophy of Confucius gave poetry a central place in education and moral development. Confucius himself studied the ancient songs and believed they could refine character, teaching people about proper conduct, loyalty, and the subtle emotions that defined human relationships. For him, poetry was not decoration, but instruction, a way to understand both the world and oneself. His emphasis on studying poetry meant that for thousands of years, aspiring scholars in China would memorize vast numbers of verses as part of their education. As dynasties rose and fell, poetry continued to evolve. During the Han Dynasty, poets developed the fu, a form of rhapsody or descriptive poem that could extend to great lengths, depicting imperial hunts, palace architecture, or the grandeur of capital cities. These elaborate compositions showed off the poet's learning and command of language, weaving together historical allusions and vivid descriptions in intricate patterns. But it was during the Tang dynasty, spanning from the 7th to the 10th century of the Common Era, that Chinese poetry reached what many consider its golden age. The Tang court valued poetry so highly that examinations for government positions included tests of poetic composition. An official needed to be not just an administrator, but an artist with words. This expectation meant that countless educated men devoted themselves to perfecting their craft, and the sheer volume of talented poets during this period was extraordinary. The Tang poets developed regulated verse forms with strict rules about line length, tonal patterns, and rhyme schemes. The Chinese language, with its tones and characters that could carry multiple meanings, offered unique possibilities for wordplay and resonance. A skilled poet could layer meanings within a brief verse, allowing different interpretations to coexist like reflections in water. Among the Tang masters, Li Bai stands as perhaps the most celebrated. His poems captured spontaneity and freedom, often celebrating wine, friendship, and the beauty of natural landscapes. Li Bai wrote of moonlight on rivers, of saying farewell to friends departing on journeys, of ancient ruins that spoke of impermanence. His verses seemed effortless, though they demonstrated perfect control of form. Stories grew around him, some true and others legendary, painting him as a romantic figure who wandered the empire, composing poems wherever inspiration struck. His contemporary Du Fu took a different approach, using poetry to document the troubles of his times with compassionate precision. Du Fu lived through rebellion and war, experiencing exile and hardship. His poems recorded these difficulties without losing sight of small beauties. A flower blooming in the ruins, the sound of rain on a thatched roof. An old friend remembered, where Li Bai seemed to dance through his verses. Du Fu walked with careful attention, noticing everything. Wang Wei, another great Tang poet, was also an accomplished painter and musician. His poems created landscapes in words, describing mountain retreats and autumn forests with such clarity that readers could visualize every detail. Wang Wei practiced Buddhism, and his verses often conveyed a sense of tranquility and detachment, finding meaning in moments of stillness and contemplation. The Tang poets wrote about parting and reunion, themes that resonated deeply in a vast empire where duty might take a person far from home for years. They wrote about the seasons, each carrying its own emotional associations. Spring's renewal, autumn's melancholy, winter's austerity. They wrote about the past, conversing across centuries with earlier poets, responding to ancient verses with new compositions that continued the dialogue. Chinese poetry developed several standard forms during this period. The jueju, or quatrain, contained just 4 lines, but could encompass profound thoughts or create complete scenes. The lu shai, or regulated verse, extended to 8 lines with precise structural requirements. Poets also composed in older, freer forms, and the tradition accommodated both strict discipline and creative variation. Beyond the famous names, countless other poets contributed to this flourishing. Women poets, though fewer in number due to educational limitations, created remarkable works. Court ladies wrote verses exchanged among themselves, and courtesans, often well-educated, composed poems that circulated through literary circles. The nun Yu Xuanji left behind poems of striking emotional honesty before her tragic early death. Poetry gatherings became social institutions. Friends would meet to drink wine, enjoy the landscape, and compose verses together, sometimes as competitions or collaborative exercises. A host might provide the first line, and guests would complete poems following that opening, or poets would each contribute to a longer sequence, each verse responding to what came before. These gatherings reinforced poetry's role as social glue, binding together people of similar education and sensibility. As the Tang dynasty eventually declined and gave way to the Song dynasty, poetry continued to evolve. New forms emerged, including the CI, verses set to specific musical tunes with irregular line lengths determined by the melody. But the foundations laid during the Tang period remained central to Chinese poetry for centuries, establishing standards of excellence and a repertoire of images, themes, and techniques that later poets would study, imitate, and transform according to their own insights and circumstances. The tradition demonstrated that poetry could be simultaneously personal and universal, capturing individual moments while expressing truths that transcended any single lifetime. As we journey eastward across the sea from China, we arrive in the island nation of Japan, where poetry evolved into something uniquely refined and crystalline. Here, in these mountainous islands where mist gathers in valleys and cherry blossoms fall like snow, poets developed an aesthetic sensibility that prized suggestion over statement and silence as much as sound. The Japanese poetic tradition would come to distill the essence of human experience into forms so brief, so carefully chosen, that every syllable carried the weight of worlds. The story of classical Japanese poetry begins in the imperial court during what historians call the Heian period, which spanned from the late 8th century to the late 12th century. This was an age of extraordinary cultural flowering, when aristocrats devoted themselves to the art with an intensity rarely matched in human history. In this rarefied world, the ability to compose poetry was not merely an accomplishment, but an essential social skill, as fundamental as breathing. Courtiers exchanged poems as we might exchange text messages today, but with infinitely more care and consequence. The dominant form of this era was the tanka, sometimes called the waka, consisting of precisely 31 syllables arranged in 5 lines following a pattern of 5, 7, 5, 7, and 7 syllables. Within this compact structure, poets captured moments of seasonal beauty, expressed longing for distant lovers, or contemplated the fleeting nature of existence. The tanka became the vehicle for everything from courtship to philosophical meditation, and mastery of the form could determine one's social standing and romantic prospects. One of the most celebrated poets of this period was a woman known as Murasaki Shikibu, who lived around the year 1000. While she is perhaps better remembered as the author of The Tale of Genji, often considered the world's first novel, she was also an accomplished poet. The culture that produced her was one in which women of the aristocracy were often more literate in Japanese than their male counterparts, who focused their studies on classical Chinese. This created space for female voices to flourish in Japanese poetry in ways that were uncommon in many other societies of the time. Another remarkable voice was that of Izumi Shikibu, a contemporary of Murasaki, whose passionate and emotionally direct poems about love and loss were considered scandalous by some and brilliant by others. Her work revealed the deeply personal potential of the tanka form, showing how 31 syllables could contain vast emotional landscapes. The diary attributed to her records poems exchanged with lovers, each verse a carefully constructed response to the previous one, creating conversations that could stretch across days and seasons. Japanese poets developed an intricate vocabulary of seasonal references called kigo, which allowed them to evoke entire atmospheres with a single word. The mention of cherry blossoms immediately placed a poem in spring and carried associations of beauty and impermanence. Autumn brought images of deer calling in mountains and the poignant beauty of red maple leaves. These seasonal markers were not mere decoration, but carried layers of emotional and philosophical meaning that any educated reader would immediately recognize. As centuries passed, Japanese poetry continued to evolve. During the medieval period, a practice called renga emerged, in which multiple poets would gather to compose linked verses. One poet would compose the opening 3 lines of a tanka, and another would complete it with 2 lines of 7 syllables each. Then the next poet would add 3 new lines that linked to the previous 2, while taking the poem in a new direction. These sessions could continue for hours, producing chains of 100 verses or more, each linked to what came before, yet independent enough to stand alone. It was from this tradition of linked verse that the haiku would eventually emerge. The opening verse of a renga sequence, called a hoku, needed to be particularly strong since it set the tone for everything that followed. Masters of renga began to craft these opening verses with special care, and gradually, poets began to appreciate these 3-line verses as complete poems in their own right. The poet who would transform the hoku into what we now know as haiku lived in the 17th century and took the name Matsuo Basho. He was born into a samurai family of modest means and served as a companion to the son of a local lord. But he chose to leave that secure position to pursue a life dedicated to poetry. Basho traveled extensively through Japan, often living in poverty and solitude, seeking in nature and in encounters with common people the material for his verse. Basho elevated the 17-syllable form to an art of profound depth and simplicity. His most famous haiku describes an old pond, a frog jumping, and the sound of water. In these few words, he captured not just a moment, but an entire philosophy of presence and awareness. His poems were not meant to be clever or particularly beautiful in conventional ways, but rather to point toward moments of sudden insight or recognition, what Zen practitioners might call glimpses of enlightenment. Following Basho, other masters continued to refine the haiku. Yosabu Son, who lived in the 18th century, brought a painter's eye to his verses, creating images of remarkable visual clarity. Kobayashi Issa, whose life spanned the late 18th and early 19th centuries, infused his poems with humor and compassion. often focusing on small creatures like snails and sparrows, seeing in them reflections of human vulnerability and persistence. The aesthetic principles that guided Japanese poetry went beyond mere technique. Concepts like aware, the poignant awareness of the transience of things, and yugen, a profound, mysterious beauty that suggests more than it states, shaped how poets approached their craft. There was an appreciation for what was called sabi, the beauty found in loneliness and solitude, and wabi, the elegance of simplicity and rustic imperfection. These were not just artistic preferences, but ways of seeing the world, philosophies compressed into single words. In the courts and monasteries, in mountain hermitages and busy market towns, Japanese poets refined their art across centuries. They created forms that would eventually travel far beyond their islands, inspiring poets around the world. Yet even as their influence spread globally, classical Japanese poetry remained rooted in a particular way of paying attention to the world, a cultivation of awareness that found infinity in the smallest moments and saw each instant as containing all time. As our story of poetry continues its journey, we will travel westward once more, to the lands where Persian and Arabic poets were creating their own magnificent traditions, using elaborate forms and mystical imagery to explore love, both earthly and divine. As we journey westward from the refined poetic gardens of Japan, we find ourselves in lands where poetry became woven into the very fabric of divine expression and earthly passion. The vast territories stretching from Persia through the Arabian Peninsula witnessed a remarkable flowering of poetic art, where words became vessels for both mystical revelation and the most profound human emotions. In the Arabian deserts before the rise of Islam, poetry already held a place of extraordinary honor. Tribal peoples gathered at great fairs where poets competed, their verses so treasured that the finest were written in gold and hung in sacred spaces. These early poets crafted elaborate odes called qasidas, beginning traditionally with nostalgic reflections on abandoned campsite where loved ones once dwelled, then moving through descriptions of arduous desert journeys before arriving at their true purpose, whether praise, satire, or philosophical meditation. The precision of their language, the complexity of their metaphors, and the musicality of their rhyme schemes established standards that would echo through centuries. When Arabic became the language of Islamic civilization, poetry found new purposes while maintaining its ancient prestige. The Quran itself, though not considered poetry by believers, employed rhythmic prose of such beauty that it influenced all subsequent literary expression in Arabic. Poets now explored themes of faith alongside traditional subjects, creating works that could move seamlessly between earthly and divine love, finding no contradiction between the two. In Persia, poetry achieved a status perhaps unmatched in any other civilization. Here, to be cultured meant to know poetry, to quote it in conversation, to understand its subtle references and layered meanings. Persian poets inherited both Arabic forms and their own ancient traditions, blending them into something uniquely magnificent. They developed the ghazal, a form consisting of rhyming couplets and a refrain. Each couplet complete in itself, yet contributing to a larger emotional and spiritual landscape. The ghazal became the perfect vehicle for expressing the intoxication of love, whether for another person or for the divine, and often deliberately blurring the distinction between the two. Ferdowsi, in the 10th century, composed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic of some 50,000 couplets that preserved Persian history, mythology, and identity through turbulent times of conquest and change. His verses kept alive the memory of ancient heroes and the values of Persian civilization, becoming a cornerstone of cultural survival. Yet the Shahnameh was only the beginning of Persian poetry's golden age. Omar Khayyam, the mathematician and astronomer of the 11th and 12th centuries, left behind quatrains, four-line poems called rubaiyat, that contemplated existence with a directness both startling and gentle. His verses pondered the brevity of life, the mysteries beyond human understanding, and the wisdom of finding joy in the present moment. Though later translations would make him famous in the West, his Persian originals possessed a philosophical depth and linguistic precision that earned him deep respect in his own literary tradition. But perhaps no poet in any language has touched as many hearts across as many cultures as Rumi, the 13th century mystic, whose poems continue to speak to readers centuries after his death. Born in what is now Afghanistan, Rumi eventually settled in Konya, in present-day Turkey, where a transformative friendship with a wandering mystic named Shams of Tabriz unlocked torrents of poetic expression. Rumi's poems, collected in the massive Masnavi and the Divan, used everyday images, stories, jokes, and paradoxes to point toward transcendent realities. He wrote of love as the fundamental force of existence, of the soul's longing to return to its source, of the divine presence hidden in plain sight within ordinary life. What made Rumi's poetry so powerful was its combination of profound spiritual insight with accessible, often playful language. He wrote of chickpeas boiling in pots, of reeds cut from reed beds crying out their longing for home, of children forgetting themselves in play. His poems invited readers into direct experience rather than abstract theology, using the concrete to illuminate the infinite. The whirling dance of the Mevlevi dervishes, inspired by Rumi's teachings, became itself a form of poetry in motion, a physical expression of the soul's circular journey toward union with the beloved. Hafiz, writing in 14th century Shiraz, brought the ghazal to such perfection that his collected works, the Divan of Hafiz, became a household treasure throughout Persian-speaking lands. People consulted his poems for guidance, opening his book at random to find wisdom for their situations. His verses played with symbols and meanings in ways that allowed multiple readings, conventional religious interpretations existing alongside more subversive suggestions. A poem about wine and taverns might be purely mystical allegory, or it might celebrate actual earthly pleasures, or somehow both simultaneously. This ambiguity was not confusion, but rather a sophisticated recognition that truth operates on multiple levels at once. Sadi, another master from Shiraz, a century before Hafiz, composed works that combined poetry with prose, including the beloved Gulistan, or Rose Garden, and the Bustan, or Orchard. His verses offered practical wisdom wrapped in beautiful language, stories with morals that never became heavy-handed, observations about human nature that remained fresh across centuries. Sadi's tomb became a pilgrimage site, and his words were carved into buildings and quoted in conversation throughout the Persian-speaking world. These poets wrote within elaborate formal constraints that would seem impossibly difficult to modern readers. The ghazal required not just rhyme, but monorhyme, the same rhyme sound maintained throughout the entire poem. Classical Persian and Arabic poetry employed quantitative meters based on syllable length, creating complex rhythmic patterns. Poets incorporated their own names into final couplets, leaving signatures within the poems themselves. Yet within these strict forms, they achieved extraordinary freedom of expression, proving that limitation can liberate rather than constrain creative imagination. The themes these poets explored became the common property of their cultures. The nightingale's love for the rose, the moth's fatal attraction to the flame, the wine of spiritual intoxication, the beloved whose face reflected divine beauty, all became a shared symbolic vocabulary that allowed poets and readers to communicate about matters too profound for literal speech. This tradition understood that the most important truths cannot be stated directly, but must be approached through suggestion, metaphor, and the music of language itself. As these poetic traditions flourished, they influenced one another and spread across vast territories. Turkish poetry developed its own classical tradition, heavily influenced by Persian models. Poetry in Urdu, the language that emerged in the Indian subcontinent, drew deeply from Persian sources while creating its own distinctive voice. Meanwhile, in Al-Andalus, the Muslim territories of medieval Spain, Arabic poetry mixed with local influences, creating forms that would eventually affect European traditions as well. The legacy of this poetic flowering continues to resonate today. Rumi remains one of the most widely read poets in the world, his works translated into countless languages. The ghazal form has been adopted by poets writing in English and other Western languages. The understanding that poetry can serve as a path to spiritual awakening, that it can speak simultaneously of human and divine love, that it can use beauty as a vehicle for truth. These insights continue to inspire poets and readers across all boundaries of culture and belief. As the golden age of Persian and Arabic poetry continued to flourish in the East, Europe was experiencing its own remarkable period of poetic transformation. The centuries we now call the Middle Ages witnessed an extraordinary diversity of poetic voices, from the mist-shrouded halls of Anglo-Saxon England to the sun-drenched courtyards of southern France, where troubadours sang of love and longing. The poetry of medieval Europe emerged from a world vastly different from the classical civilizations that had come before. This was an era of castles and monasteries, of pilgrimages and crusades, of feudal obligations and spiritual devotion. Poetry served many purposes in this complex society, acting as entertainment, education, religious instruction, and a means of preserving cultural memory across generations who could not read or write. In the early medieval period, monks in quiet scriptoriums became the unlikely guardians of poetic tradition. These dedicated scribes copied not only religious texts, but also preserved ancient poems that might otherwise have been lost forever. The monasteries of Ireland and England proved particularly important in this cultural preservation, creating illuminated manuscripts where words and images intertwined in breathtaking beauty. One of the earliest masterpieces of medieval European poetry comes to us from Anglo-Saxon England. Beowulf, composed sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, tells the story of a hero who battles monsters and dragons. The poem uses a distinctive verse form called alliterative meter, where lines are linked not by end rhymes but by repeating consonant sounds at the beginning of stressed syllables. When recited aloud, this creates a powerful, almost hypnotic rhythm that would have captivated listeners gathered in smoky mead halls on winter nights. The Anglo-Saxon poets, known as Scots, developed a rich vocabulary of poetic compounds called kennings. The sea might be called the whale road, the body a bone house, a ship a wave traveler. These imaginative phrases added layers of meaning and beauty to their verses, transforming simple descriptions into evocative imagery that sparked the imagination. As centuries passed, poetry in medieval Europe began to reflect the growing influence of Christianity. Religious poems explored themes of faith, salvation, and the lives of saints. In churches and cathedrals, liturgical poetry enhanced worship services, with Latin hymns rising toward vaulted ceilings. These sacred poems often featured intricate rhyme schemes and meter, demonstrating that devotion and artistic sophistication could walk hand in hand. Yet medieval poetry was not solely concerned with the spiritual realm. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a revolutionary new poetic tradition emerged in the courts of southern France. The troubadours, traveling poet-musicians of Occitania, created verses that celebrated refined, idealized love. Writing in the Occitan language, these poets developed the concept of courtly love, where a noble lover devoted himself to an unattainable lady, serving her as faithfully as a knight served his lord. The troubadours crafted intricate songs using complex rhyme schemes and melodic patterns. Their poems explored the joys and sorrows of love with unprecedented psychological subtlety, examining jealousy, longing, and the transformative power of devotion. These weren't simple love songs, but sophisticated meditations on emotion and desire, expressed through elaborate metaphors drawn from feudal society and the natural world. The influence of the troubadours spread northward, inspiring similar traditions across medieval Europe. In northern France, the trouvères adapted the southern style to their own language and customs. In Germany, the Minnesingers created their own tradition of love poetry, while in Spain and Portugal, poets developed distinctive forms that blended European and Arabic influences, reflecting the complex cultural interactions of the Iberian Peninsula. Medieval poetry also served as a vehicle for storytelling on an epic scale. The chansons de geste, or songs of heroic deeds, recounted the adventures of legendary warriors like Roland, whose last stand at Roncevaux Pass became one of the most celebrated stories of medieval literature. These long narrative poems, often performed by wandering minstrels, kept alive the memory of historical events, though filtered through layers of legendary embellishment and moral instruction. In Italy, poetry evolved in fascinating directions as the medieval period progressed. Sicilian poets at the court of Frederick II in the 13th century developed the sonnet, a 14-line form that would become one of poetry's most enduring structures. This innovation spread throughout the Italian peninsula, inspiring generations of poets who found in the sonnet's compact structure the perfect vehicle for exploring complex emotions and ideas. Meanwhile, in the universities and courts of medieval Europe, poets experimented with verses that combined entertainment and instruction. Allegories became particularly popular, with poets creating elaborate symbolic narratives where abstract concepts like love, virtue, or death appeared as characters. These poems allowed poets to explore philosophical and moral questions while engaging audiences with vivid imagery and compelling stories. The later Middle Ages saw poetry becoming increasingly accessible beyond the aristocratic courts and monasteries. In growing towns and cities, poetry became part of urban culture, with craftsmen's guilds in places like Germany sponsoring their own poetic competitions. The Meister singers, master craftsmen who were also accomplished poets, created elaborate rules for composition and performance, treating poetry almost as a craft to be learned through apprenticeship and practice. Medieval poets also used their verses to comment on contemporary events and social conditions. Political poems criticized rulers. Satirical verses mocked corruption and hypocrisy, and poems of social commentary highlighted the struggles of common people. These works remind us that medieval poetry was not confined to romantic idealization or religious devotion, but engaged deeply with the realities of its time. As the medieval period drew toward its close, European poetry had transformed profoundly from its early beginnings. What had started as alliterative verses recited in warrior halls had evolved into a rich tapestry of forms and voices. Poets had developed sophisticated techniques for expressing emotion, telling stories, exploring philosophy, and capturing the complexity of human experience. The stage was set for the great revival of classical learning that would characterize the Renaissance, when poets would look both backward to ancient models and forward to new possibilities, building upon the substantial foundations their medieval predecessors had laid. As the medieval world gradually transformed, a great awakening began to stir across the European continent. The period we now call the Renaissance brought with it a rediscovery of classical learning, and nowhere was this rebirth more evident than in the realm of poetry. The ancient texts that had been preserved in monasteries, translated by Arabic scholars, and carried along trade routes began to inspire a new generation of poets who looked both backward to classical masters and forward to fresh possibilities. In Italy, where this cultural flowering first took root, Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch, sat in his study in the 14th century, composing verses that would echo through the ages. His poetry reflected a fascinating tension between the medieval world he inherited and the classical world he admired. Writing in both Latin and Italian, Petrarch crafted sonnets that explored the nature of love, time, and human consciousness with an intimacy that felt remarkably personal. His collection of poems dedicated to Laura, a woman he claimed to have glimpsed in a church, became a model for expressing idealized love through carefully structured verse. The sonnet form itself, which Petrarch perfected though he did not invent, became one of the Renaissance's greatest gifts to world poetry. 14 lines arranged in an octave and a sestet, with a specific rhyme scheme that created a natural turn or shift in thought. The Italian sonnet provided poets with a structure both demanding and liberating. Within these constraints, poets found they could capture complex emotions and ideas, moving from problem to resolution, from question to answer, from observation to insight. From Italy, the Renaissance spirit spread across the Alps and throughout Europe. In England, poets began experimenting with these newly rediscovered classical forms, while adapting them to their own language and sensibilities. Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, introduced the sonnet to English poetry in the early 16th century, modifying its structure to suit the different rhythms and sounds of English verse. The form they developed, with 3 quatrains and a concluding couplet, would later be associated with the greatest poet of the English language. William Shakespeare, working at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, perfected the English sonnet form in his sequence of 154 poems. These sonnets explored themes of love, beauty, time, and mortality, with a linguistic richness and psychological depth that continues to astonish readers. Shakespeare demonstrated how the sonnet structure could mirror human thought itself, with the final couplet offering a surprising turn, a philosophical conclusion, or sometimes a witty subversion of everything that came before. While Shakespeare is better remembered today for his plays, his contemporaries also included other remarkable poets who experimented with classical forms and Renaissance ideas. Edmund Spenser created elaborate allegorical poetry, most notably in his epic work The Faerie Queene, which combined medieval romance with classical structure and Protestant theology. His Spenserian sonnet, with its interlocking rhyme scheme, added yet another variation to the form, showing how Renaissance poets constantly refined and reimagined their inherited structures. In Italy, poetry reached heights of ambition that recalled the great epics of Homer and Virgil. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 14th century, at the dawn of the Renaissance, created the Divine Comedy, a massive poem that described a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Writing in Italian rather than Latin, Dante helped establish the vernacular as a language worthy of high art. His terza rima form, with its interlocking 3-line stanzas, created a sense of continuous forward movement perfectly suited to his pilgrim's journey. The poem combined medieval Christian cosmology with classical learning, personal political commentary with universal spiritual truths, creating a work that served as both culmination of medieval thought and herald of Renaissance humanism. Across the English Channel, centuries later, John Milton undertook an equally ambitious project. His epic poem, Paradise Lost, composed in the mid-17th century, reimagined the biblical story of humanity's fall from grace in the style of classical epic poetry. Writing in blank verse rather than rhyme, Milton created rolling lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter that could accommodate philosophical arguments, dramatic speeches, and vivid descriptions of celestial warfare. His language reached for a grandeur that matched his cosmic subject matter, demonstrating how Renaissance poets could use classical forms to explore Christian themes with a complexity that earlier medieval poetry rarely attempted. The Renaissance poets shared a belief in the power of poetry to shape both language and thought. They studied rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and applied its principles to verse. They explored how sound patterns could reinforce meaning, how imagery could illuminate abstract ideas, how structure itself could embody the concepts a poem examined. Poetry during this period was considered not merely decorative, but essential, a way of thinking through the most profound questions about human existence, divine nature, and the structure of reality itself. In France, poets formed themselves into groups with specific artistic programs. The Pléiade, led by Pierre de Ronsard, sought to elevate French poetry to rival the classics by importing Greek and Roman forms while enriching the French language itself. They believed poets had a noble calling, that verse could civilize a nation and preserve its glory. Their confidence in poetry's importance reflected the Renaissance spirit that placed human creativity and achievement at the center of cultural life. The religious upheavals of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation also found expression in Renaissance poetry. Devotional verse flourished as poets used their craft to explore and express faith. The sonnet, which had been perfected for expressing romantic love, proved equally suited to expressing spiritual longing. Poets discovered that the same structures that captured the contradictions of human love could illuminate the paradoxes of divine grace. As the Renaissance period gradually gave way to new movements and ideas, poetry had been transformed. The classical forms had been recovered, adapted, and reimagined. The vernacular languages had been refined into instruments capable of both philosophical precision and emotional intensity. Individual poets had demonstrated that verse could accommodate personal voice while working within established structures. The relationship between form and meaning had been explored with unprecedented sophistication. This legacy would shape poetry for centuries to come. The sonnet remained a vital form into the modern era. The notion that poetry should be carefully crafted, that it required both inspiration and technique, became foundational to how poets understood their art. The Renaissance had shown that looking backward to classical models could generate forward momentum, that tradition and innovation were not opposites, but partners in the ongoing evolution of poetry. As the fervor of the Renaissance gradually gave way to new ways of thinking, European society entered an era that would come to be known as the Enlightenment. The 17th and 18th centuries brought with them a different atmosphere, one where reason, logic, and careful observation were prized above all else. The grand passions and elaborate ornamentation of earlier periods began to seem excessive to many thinkers and writers of this new age. Poetry, too, would transform to reflect these changing values, finding new purposes and new forms of expression. In England, the late 17th century saw the emergence of poets who valued clarity, wit, and precision in their verse. The chaos of civil war and political upheaval had given way to a desire for order and balance. Writers looked back to classical Roman poets, especially Horace, as models of restraint and elegance. They admired how ancient writers could convey profound ideas with economy and grace, without unnecessary embellishment or emotional excess. The heroic couplet became the dominant form of this period, a pair of rhyming lines in iambic pentameter that could be polished until it gleamed like marble. These couplets allowed poets to craft memorable, quotable expressions of ideas. Each pair of lines formed a complete thought, balanced and self-contained. perfectly suited to an age that valued proportion and harmony. Alexander Pope emerged as perhaps the finest craftsman of this poetic style. Born in London in 1688, Pope suffered from poor health throughout his life, which left him short in stature and in frequent discomfort. Yet his mind was sharp, and his ear for the music of language was extraordinary. He could take the heroic couplet and make it dance, turning even the most abstract ideas into verse that felt effortless and inevitable. Pope's early work, an essay on criticism, appeared when he was just 23 years old. In this remarkable poem, he offered guidance on both writing and evaluating literature, all while demonstrating his own mastery of the form. The poem contained observations that have become so familiar they feel timeless. He wrote of how a little learning is a dangerous thing, and suggested that critics should drink deep or taste not from the springs of knowledge. He advised that true wit was nature to advantage dressed, meaning that the best writing made natural truths appear in their most elegant form. What made Pope's poetry so suited to his age was how it could convey complex ideas with apparent ease. His verses moved smoothly from one thought to the next, building arguments through the accumulation of perfectly balanced lines. Reading Pope, one felt simultaneously entertained and instructed, amused and enlightened. His translation of Homer's Iliad, completed over several years in the early 1720s, brought him both fame and financial security. While later critics would note that Pope's Homer reflected 18th century sensibilities more than ancient Greek ones, his contemporaries found in his version a perfect marriage of classical content and modern expression. The subscription system he used for publishing the work allowed him to become one of the first English poets to support himself entirely through his writing, without depending on noble patrons. Pope's masterpiece, The Rape of the Lock, demonstrated how the elevated language of epic poetry could be applied to trivial social conflicts with brilliant comic effect. The poem told of a young lord who snipped a lock of hair from a lady without her permission, and the social catastrophe that ensued. By treating this minor incident with the grand machinery of epic poetry, complete with supernatural beings and heroic battles, Pope gently satirized the values of fashionable society while creating something genuinely beautiful. Jonathan Swift, though perhaps better remembered for his prose works, also contributed significantly to the poetry of this age. His verses carried a sharper edge than Pope's, often directing wit toward darker targets. Swift had little patience for human pretension or folly, and his poems could be bitingly satirical. Yet they shared with Pope's work that characteristic Enlightenment clarity, using precise language to cut through confusion and expose reality as he saw it. The coffee houses of London provided fertile ground for poetic discussion and debate during this period. Writers would gather in these establishments to share their latest compositions, offer criticism, and engage in literary conversation. Poetry was seen not as the solitary outpouring of individual emotion, but as a social art form, something to be discussed, refined and perfected through collaborative attention. As the 18th century progressed, new voices began to emerge that would eventually challenge the dominance of this rational, polished style. Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, published in 1751, represented something of a bridge between periods. While it maintained the formal elegance valued by Pope's generation, it also dwelt on themes of melancholy and mortality in ways that pointed toward different possibilities for poetry. Gray's meditation on the graves of ordinary villagers, with its famous reflection that the paths of glory lead but to the grave, touched readers deeply and has remained beloved for its combination of formal grace and genuine feeling. Poets of this era also used their art for social commentary and political engagement. They wrote verses on current events, satirized public figures, and commented on the issues of their day. Poetry served as a way to participate in public discourse, to shape opinion, and influence thought. The assumption was that well-crafted verse could convey truth more memorably and effectively than plain prose, that the discipline of meter and rhyme could actually sharpen and clarify meaning rather than obscuring it. In France and across the European continent, similar movements toward clarity and reason influenced poetic development. Voltaire, though primarily remembered as a philosopher and prose writer, composed verses that exemplified Enlightenment values. The salons of Paris, like London's coffee houses, became centers where poets could share and discuss their work. By the final decades of the 18th century, however, the limitations of this rational approach to poetry were becoming apparent to some writers. The very qualities that had made Enlightenment verse so polished and precise could also make it feel constrained and artificial. The emphasis on general truths and universal human nature sometimes left little room for individual experience or the particular observation. The preference for intellectual content over emotional expression began to feel restrictive to poets seeking to capture different aspects of human existence. Yet the achievements of Enlightenment poetry remained significant. These poets had demonstrated that verse could be a vehicle for ideas, that poetry need not abandon clarity in pursuit of beauty. They had shown how traditional forms could be perfected through patient craftsmanship, and they had made poetry an integral part of public intellectual life. As new movements would soon emerge to challenge their assumptions, the foundation they built would remain part of poetry's heritage, a reminder that the art could serve many purposes and speak in many voices, each valuable in its own way. As the 18th century drew to a close, the measured couplets and polished verses of the Enlightenment began to feel constraining to a new generation of poets. The age of reason, with its emphasis on logic, order, and classical restraint, had produced remarkable poetry. Yet something stirred in the hearts of younger writers. They looked at the rational world their predecessors had built and felt a longing for something more, something that spoke to depths of feeling the Enlightenment had kept carefully controlled. In the closing years of the 1790s, in the English countryside, far from London's literary circles, two poets began meeting to share their work and their radical ideas about what poetry could be. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge walked together through the Lake District, discussing their conviction that poetry had lost touch with genuine human emotion and the profound lessons nature could teach. They envisioned a poetry stripped of artificial language, one that would speak in the actual words of ordinary people and celebrate the sublime power of the natural world. Their collaboration resulted in a slender volume published in 1798 called Lyrical Ballads. The collection opened with Coleridge's mysterious tale, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a haunting narrative about a sailor cursed for killing an albatross. Unlike the neat moral lessons of earlier poetry, this poem plunged readers into a dreamlike world where supernatural events mingled with psychological torment and ultimate redemption. Wordsworth contributed poems celebrating humble subjects, including lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, where he explored how memories of nature sustain the human spirit through difficult times. In the preface to later editions, Wordsworth articulated ideas that would define Romantic poetry. He declared that poetry should be the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, originating from emotion recollected in tranquility. This was revolutionary. Rather than following prescribed rules about suitable subjects and proper language, Wordsworth argued that poetry should emerge from authentic personal experience and genuine emotion. A simple encounter with a field of daffodils or a conversation with an old leech gatherer could be as worthy of poetry as ancient battles or mythological heroes. Wordsworth found particular inspiration in childhood and memory. He believed children possessed an innate connection to nature and spiritual truth that civilization gradually obscured. His long autobiographical poem, The Prelude, traced the growth of his own poetic consciousness, exploring how encounters with mountains, lakes, and storms had shaped his imagination. He wrote of spots of time, moments of intense experience whose memory continued to nourish the soul years later. While Wordsworth celebrated nature's gentle instruction, Coleridge ventured into more mysterious territories of imagination. His unfinished poem, Kubla Khan, emerged, he claimed, from an opium-induced dream, presenting vivid images of an exotic palace where twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girdled round. In Christabel, he explored Gothic themes of innocence threatened by sinister forces. Coleridge believed imagination was not mere fancy, but a creative power that could perceive deeper truths hidden from ordinary perception. A younger generation of poets pushed romantic ideas even further. John Keats, son of a stable keeper, began writing poetry in his early 20s while training as a surgeon. His poems luxuriated in sensory beauty, creating lines so rich in texture, color, and sound that readers could almost taste and touch what he described. In his Ode to a Nightingale, Keats listened to a bird's song and found himself transported beyond the boundaries of his mortal existence, longing to dissolve into the eternal beauty the nightingale represented. His Ode on a Grecian Urn contemplated an ancient artifact, finding in its frozen scenes a paradoxical truth. Art preserves moments beyond time's destruction, offering a beauty that transcends human mortality. Keats developed a concept he called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. This tolerance for ambiguity and embrace of unanswered questions contrasted sharply with Enlightenment rationalism. Keats died of tuberculosis at only 25, but his brief career produced poems of extraordinary richness that continue to captivate readers with their sensuous beauty and philosophical depth. Percy Bysshe. Shelley brought fierce political idealism to Romantic poetry. He believed poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, possessing unique insight into truth and justice. His poem, Ozymandias, contemplated the ruins of a tyrant's monument in the desert, where a boastful inscription about mighty works contrasted ironically with the empty, decayed surroundings. The poem suggested that all human power eventually crumbles, while art endures. In Ode to the West Wind, Shelley addressed the autumn wind as a force of both destruction and renewal, asking it to scatter his words across the earth like leaves carrying seeds of change. Lord Byron created a different kind of romantic poetry, infused with worldly sophistication, devastating wit, and barely concealed autobiography. His long narrative poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, followed a disillusioned aristocrat traveling through Europe, and readers recognized Byron himself in the proud, melancholy hero. Byron became the era's first literary celebrity, his scandalous personal life as famous as his verses. His mock epic, Don Juan, demonstrated that romantic poetry need not be solemn. It could be playful, satirical, and irreverent while still exploring serious themes of love, politics, and human nature. Women poets also contributed vital voices to romantic literature, though they often received less recognition. Dorothy Wordsworth, William's sister, kept journals filled with precise, natural observations that influenced her brother's poetry. Her own writing captured moments with stunning clarity and emotional resonance. Other women poets navigated social expectations while developing their craft, finding ways to express their perspectives within and sometimes against the conventions of their time. The Romantic movement emphasized the individual imagination, the power of emotion, and the spiritual lessons of nature. These poets believed that feeling deeply was not weakness, but a path to truth. They saw childhood innocence, passionate love, and encounters with sublime landscapes as experiences that revealed fundamental realities obscured by conventional society. They valued spontaneity over rigid rules, authenticity over artificial polish, and the mysterious over the explicable. As their influence spread beyond England to Europe, and eventually across the Atlantic to America, the Romantics fundamentally changed what poetry could be and do. They had opened doors that would never fully close again, establishing that poetry belonged not just to the educated elite, but to anyone capable of feeling intensely and imagining boldly. The revolution they began would echo through all the poetry that followed, even as new movements arose to challenge or refine their ideas. As the Romantic movement flourished across Europe, a vast ocean away, the young American nation was beginning to discover its own poetic voice. The early poets of the United States found themselves in a peculiar position, inheriting the rich traditions of English verse while living in a landscape and society fundamentally different from anything their literary ancestors had known. The challenge before them was nothing less than creating a poetry that could capture the essence of a new world. In the colonial period and early decades of the Republic, American poetry remained closely tethered to British models. Anne Bradstreet, writing in the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 17th century, composed verses that echoed the metaphysical poets of England, even as she described experiences unique to the New World. Her poems about family life, faith, and the burning of her home in 1666 were crafted in careful couplets and formal structures that would have been familiar to any educated reader in London. Similarly, Phyllis Wheatley, brought to Boston from West Africa as an enslaved child, demonstrated remarkable mastery of neoclassical forms in the 1770s, proving her intellectual equality to her contemporaries while working within the established conventions of 18th century verse. Yet as the 19th century progressed, American poets began to sense that these inherited forms, elegant as they were, could not fully express the distinctive character of their nation. The vast wilderness stretching westward, the experiment in democratic government, the mixing of peoples from different lands, the optimism and energy of expansion, all these called for new ways of making poetry. William Cullen Bryant, composing his meditation on death, Thanatopsis, while still a teenager in western Massachusetts, found inspiration in the American forest rather than in classical mythology. His blank verse moved with a stately rhythm, reminiscent of English models, yet the landscape he described was unmistakably American. The poem invited readers to find comfort in becoming part of the earth itself, surrounded by the hills, streams, and woodlands of the natural world. Bryant would go on to become a prominent newspaper editor in New York City, but his poetry always returned to the American landscape as a source of spiritual solace and philosophical reflection. Edgar Allan Poe brought a different sensibility to American verse. Though his musical, haunting poems like The Raven and Annabel Lee followed traditional metrical patterns, they created an atmosphere of mystery and melancholy that seemed to emerge from some darker aspect of the American psyche. Poe's theories about poetry emphasized unity of effect and the importance of beauty, particularly the beauty tinged with sadness. His work influenced poets far beyond American shores, particularly the French Symbolists, who would revolutionize European poetry later in the century. In this way, American poetry began not merely receiving influence from across the Atlantic, but sending it back transformed. The most radical departure from traditional forms came from a man working as a printer, carpenter, and journalist in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, first published in 1855, announced itself as something entirely new from its opening lines. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," Whitman proclaimed, immediately establishing a voice of unprecedented confidence and individuality. But this self he sang was expansive, containing multitudes, embracing the diversity of American experience from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the enslaved person to the president. Whitman abandoned conventional meter and rhyme almost entirely, creating long, rolling lines that rose and fell like waves, that accumulated images and ideas through repetition and cataloging rather than through traditional poetic argument. His free verse seemed to breathe with the rhythm of natural speech, yet it was carefully crafted, musical in its own way, using techniques of parallelism and anaphora that echoed the King James Bible and ancient Hebrew poetry. Here was a form that seemed democratic itself, refusing the aristocratic constraints of inherited European meters. The subjects Whitman addressed were equally revolutionary. He wrote about the human body with a frankness that scandalized many readers. He celebrated ordinary workers, the carpenter, the boatman, the farmer. He described the American landscape in all its variety, from the seashore Mannahatta of his beloved New York to the prairies and mountains he would never personally see but imagined with visionary intensity. During the Civil War, Whitman served as a volunteer nurse in Washington hospitals, and his poems about that terrible conflict, particularly his elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, brought a new gravity and tenderness to his verse. Not everyone embraced Whitman's innovations. Many readers found his work crude and formless, lacking the refinement they expected from poetry. Yet even those who rejected his approach recognized that something significant had occurred. American poetry now had an alternative to the genteel tradition, a native voice that drew its power from the vernacular and from an embrace of the common rather than the elevated. While Whitman was celebrating the masses and the material world, Emily Dickinson was conducting a very different poetic experiment in her family's house in Amherst, Massachusetts. During her lifetime, she lived in relative seclusion, rarely leaving her home in her later years, and published only a handful of poems anonymously. Yet, in her upstairs bedroom, she was writing nearly 1,800 poems of startling originality and psychological depth. Dickinson worked within the familiar framework of hymn meters, the simple patterns she knew from church services, but she fractured and disrupted these forms through unexpected capitalization, unconventional punctuation using dashes, and slant rhymes that jarred the ear accustomed to perfect consonants. Her poems were brief, compressed, often enigmatic, touching on themes of death, immortality, nature, and consciousness, with an intensity that seemed to distill vast philosophical questions into a few precisely chosen words. Where Whitman expanded outward to embrace the world, Dickinson turned inward, exploring the landscape of the mind and spirit with the attention of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. A bird coming down a walk, a snake in the grass, the slant of winter light. These became occasions for profound meditation. Death appeared in her poems as a gentleman caller, as a sudden frost, as a fly's buzz interrupting a deathbed scene. She examined her own consciousness with unsentimental clarity, describing psychological states with a precision that would not seem out of place in modern psychiatry. These two poets, Whitman and Dickinson, so different in their approaches and temperaments, together established the poles of American poetic possibility. Whitman's expansive free verse and Dickinson's compressed intensity would influence generations of poets to come, offering models for how poetry might be made in the American grain, responsive to American experience yet universal in their insights into human nature. As the 19th century moved toward its close, American poetry had found its own identity, no longer merely an extension of English verse, but a living tradition with its own characteristic voices and concerns. The path was prepared for the innovations that would follow in the new century. As American poetry found its distinctive voice through the innovations of Whitman and Dickinson, the poetic landscape across the Atlantic was undergoing its own profound transformations. The later decades of the 19th century brought industrialization, urbanization, and rapid social change that would reshape how poets understood their craft and their place in the world. In England, the Victorian era produced poets who grappled with questions of faith, progress, and tradition, while in France, the Symbolist movement emerged to challenge conventional ideas about meaning and expression itself. Alfred Lord Tennyson stood as the towering figure of Victorian poetry, his work reflecting both the confidence and the anxieties of his age. When he became Poet Laureate in 1850, he assumed a public role that earlier generations might have recognized. Yet his poetry explored deeply personal grief and doubt. His long elegy, In Memoriam, written over 17 years following the death of his close friend Arthur Hallam, wove together personal loss with broader questions about faith in an age of emerging scientific understanding. The poem's quiet, measured stanzas moved between despair and hope, capturing a distinctly Victorian tension between religious certainty and modern skepticism. Tennyson could write sweeping narrative poems like The Charge of the Light Brigade, with its galloping rhythm that immortalized a military disaster, yet also craft meditative pieces that question the very foundations of belief and meaning. Robert Browning brought a different energy to Victorian poetry through his development of the dramatic monologue. His poems gave voice to historical figures, artists, and imagined characters, allowing readers to inhabit other minds and perspectives. My Last Duchess revealed a Renaissance duke's chilling possessiveness through his own words, never explicitly stating the fate of his previous wife, yet implying everything. Browning's interest in psychology and character made his poetry feel modern, exploring the complexities and contradictions within individual consciousness. His wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, created her own significant body of work, including Sonnets from the Portuguese, a sequence that renewed the sonnet form through intimate, passionate love poetry that challenged Victorian conventions about women's emotional expression. The pre-Raphaelite poets, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Christina Rossetti, sought to recover what they saw as a purer medieval sensibility, creating verse rich with color, religious imagery, and romantic longing. Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market told a strange fairy tale about temptation and sisterly love in verse that danced between simplicity and sophistication. Her religious poetry combined devotion with a quiet intensity, while her secular poems often explored themes of loss, remembrance, and renunciation with remarkable emotional precision. As Victorian poets worked within and against their traditions in England, French poetry was experiencing a more radical transformation. Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, published in 1857, marked a turning point in European poetry. Baudelaire wrote about the modern city, about beauty found in unexpected places, about the spiritual dimensions of urban alienation. His Paris was not the romantic city of earlier poets, but a space of crowds, artifice, and moral ambiguity. He described fog, gas lamps, wine shops, and the faces of strangers, finding poetry in the everyday life of boulevards and back streets. Baudelaire argued that poetry should pursue beauty without moral restriction, that the poet's task was to discover correspondences between the visible world and invisible realms of sensation and meaning. The Symbolist movement that followed Baudelaire pushed poetry even further from conventional representation. Paul Verlaine wrote verse of extraordinary musical quality, emphasizing sound and suggestion over direct statement. His art Poetic declared, "Music first and foremost," calling for poetry that was nuanced, indirect, captured in soft focus rather than sharp definition. Verlaine's poems often evoke twilight states, ambiguous moods, moments suspended between clarity and dream. Arthur Rimbaud, still a teenager when he wrote his most revolutionary work, demanded that poetry become a means of visionary experience. His prose poems in Illuminations broke down the boundaries between verse and prose, creating intense, hallucinatory images that resisted simple interpretation. Rimbaud declared that the poet must become a seer through a long, immense, and reasoned derangement of all the senses, pursuing new forms of perception and expression. His brief, brilliant poetic career ended before he reached 20, yet his influence on subsequent poetry proved immense. Stéphane Mallarmé refined symbolist principles into an almost impossibly refined aesthetic. He believed poetry should not name things directly, but rather suggest and evoke them through careful attention to sound, rhythm, and the spaces between words. Mallarmé's poems were often difficult, requiring readers to abandon expectations of straightforward meaning and instead experience language as music and mystery. His famous poem, Un coup de dés, experimented with typography and space on the page, creating visual poetry that anticipated 20th century innovations. Back in England, Gerard Manley Hopkins was conducting his own experiments with language, though his work remained largely unpublished during his lifetime. A Jesuit priest, Hopkins developed what he called sprung rhythm, a metrical system that counted stressed syllables rather than following traditional patterns of stressed and unstressed beats. His poetry compressed language, created new compound words, and used alliteration and internal rhymes to generate intense sonic effects. Poems like The Winged Skylark and Pied Beauty celebrated the particularity of natural things while seeing in them evidence of divine presence. Hopkins's innovations would not be widely known until decades after his death, when his friend Robert Bridges finally published his collected works in 1918. Thomas Hardy, known primarily as a novelist during his lifetime, turned increasingly to poetry in his later years. His verse captured the landscapes of rural England while exploring themes of time, memory, and the often painful gaps between past and present. Hardy's poems could be deceptively simple in language, while carrying complex emotional weight, examining moments of loss and regret with unflinching honesty. These poets of the later 19th century faced a world being transformed by technology, science, and social change. The railway and telegraph were reshaping experience of space and time. Darwin's theories challenged traditional understandings of human origins. Cities grew rapidly, creating new forms of urban experience and urban poverty. Victorian poets in England often addressed these changes directly, questioning, celebrating, or mourning the transformation of their world. The French Symbolists took a different approach, creating poetry that emphasized subjective experience and aesthetic autonomy, arguing that poetry need not serve moral or social purposes, but could exist as pure aesthetic experience. As the 19th century drew toward its close, poetry had traveled far from the romantic celebration of nature and emotion that had characterized its opening decades. Poets had developed new techniques, explored new subjects, and questioned fundamental assumptions about what poetry could be and do. The stage was set for the even more radical experiments that would come with the new century, as poets would fragment forms entirely and reimagine the very nature of poetic expression. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, poets across Europe and America felt an urgent need to break with tradition. The world around them was transforming at a breathtaking pace. Cities sprawled upward with steel skeletons and glass facades. Trains and automobiles accelerated the rhythm of daily life. The horrors of the First World War shattered any remaining illusions about progress and human nobility. In response to this fractured, disorienting modern world, poets began to fracture and reorient poetry itself. The movement that emerged came to be called Modernism, and it would reshape poetry as dramatically as the Romantics had done a century before. But where the Romantics had rebelled by embracing emotion and nature, the Modernists rebelled through fragmentation, illusion, and a radical questioning of poetry's very foundations. They looked at the comfortable verse forms that had dominated Victorian parlors and decided that such poetry could no longer speak truthfully about the 20th century experience. One autumn evening in London in 1922, a slender volume appeared in bookshops that would change poetry forever. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land presented readers with something they had never quite encountered before. The poem moved without warning between different speakers, different languages, different time periods. It quoted Sanskrit prayers and Shakespearean drama. It shifted from a fortune teller's parlour to the banks of the Thames, to a conversation in a London pub, all without clear transitions or explanations. Eliot had grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, studied at Harvard, and eventually settled in London, working as a bank clerk, while writing revolutionary poetry in his spare time. He believed that modern life was fragmented and chaotic, and that poetry needed to reflect that fragmentation honestly, rather than imposing false order upon it. The traditional, smooth-flowing verse of earlier generations seemed to him a kind of lie, a pretense that the world made sense when it clearly did not. The Waste Land opened with an image that inverted centuries of poetic tradition. April is the cruelest month, it began, directly contradicting the medieval poet Chaucer, who had celebrated April's sweet showers. For Eliot, spring was cruel because it forced life from the dead land, forced people to wake from comfortable numbness. This willingness to turn poetic tradition on its head characterized the entire modernist project. Working alongside Eliot, though often disagreeing with him, was Ezra Pound, an energetic American expatriate with a red beard and fierce opinions about nearly everything. Pound had arrived in London with ambitious plans to revolutionize poetry, and he threw himself into the task with remarkable energy. He championed new poets, edited their work ruthlessly, and developed theories about how poetry should function in the modern age. Pound believed poetry had become too wordy, too comfortable, too soft. He advocated for precision, for the exact word rather than the merely decorative one. He coined the term imagism for a poetic approach that emphasized clear, sharp images without unnecessary explanation. One of his own brief poems presented the apparition of these faces in the crowd as petals on a wet, black bough. Just 2 lines, but they captured something essential about urban life, about beauty glimpsed briefly amid the metropolitan masses. In America, poets were also breaking traditional forms, though sometimes in different directions. William Carlos Williams, a doctor who wrote poems between seeing patients in Rutherford, New Jersey, insisted that American poetry needed American speech rhythms, not English ones. His poems used the plain language of everyday conversation, finding poetry in wheelbarrows glazed with rainwater and plums stolen from the icebox. Meanwhile, Wallace Stevens worked as an insurance executive in Hartford, Connecticut, composing elaborate philosophical poems that questioned the nature of reality and imagination. His poems had exotic, playful titles like The Emperor of Ice Cream and 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and they explored how the human mind creates meaning in a world that might not have inherent meaning of its own. These modernist poets shared certain fundamental convictions, even when their specific techniques differed. They believed poetry should be difficult, that it should demand intellectual work from readers rather than providing easy comfort. They incorporated references to multiple literary traditions, expecting readers to recognize allusions to Dante, Homer, the Bible, and world mythology. They experimented with the poem's appearance on the page, using unconventional spacing and line breaks to control rhythm and emphasis. The modernists also believed that a poem need not explain itself completely. They left gaps, silences, moments of mystery. Eliot spoke of finding objective correlatives, external objects or situations that could evoke emotions without naming them directly. Instead of writing, "I am sad," a modernist poet might describe rain on empty streets, letting the image carry the emotional weight. These innovations sometimes bewildered readers. When The Wasteland first appeared, many reviewers found it incomprehensible. Eliot eventually published notes explaining some of his references, though whether these notes genuinely helped or simply added another layer of complexity remains a matter of debate. The poem's difficulty was partly intentional. Eliot believed that modern reality was complex and that poetry addressing it honestly could not be simple. Across the Atlantic, other poets embraced modernism's revolutionary spirit while adapting it to their own concerns. The Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who had begun his career writing lyrical verse influenced by Irish folklore, gradually incorporated modernist techniques while maintaining his interest in symbol and myth. His later poems combined obscure personal symbolism with formal mastery, creating works that felt both ancient and startlingly new. In France, poets like Guillaume Apollinaire experimented with typography, creating calligrams, where the words formed visual shapes on the page. Though Apollinaire died young in the 1918 influenza pandemic, his innovations influenced poets throughout Europe who saw the page itself as a visual space with creative possibilities. The modernist revolution extended beyond technique to subject matter. These poets wrote about urban alienation, spiritual emptiness, the difficulty of communication between people. They were less likely than earlier poets to offer consolation or moral guidance. Their poems asked questions without necessarily providing answers, reflected confusion without resolving it into clarity. Despite their revolutionary stance, the modernists remained deeply engaged with poetic tradition. Pound studied classical Chinese poetry and Anglo-Saxon verse. Eliot's poems bristled with quotations from earlier writers. They broke rules, but they knew which rules they were breaking and why. Their revolution was informed by profound knowledge of what had come before. As the 1920s progressed, modernist techniques spread widely. Younger poets experimented with fragmentation, allusion, and free verse. The movement's influence extended beyond poetry into fiction, drama, painting, and music. The sense that art should reflect modern reality's fragmentation rather than imposing false order became a defining characteristic of 20th century culture. Yet even as modernism dominated serious poetry, different voices were emerging that would challenge its assumptions. As we move forward in our story, we will discover how poetry continued evolving, how new movements arose to address concerns that modernism had perhaps overlooked, and how poets continued their eternal work of finding words for human experience in all its variety. The years between the two great conflicts of the 20th century formed a peculiar time in human history, a period suspended between the catastrophe that had passed and the storm gathering on the horizon. For poets, these decades between 1918 and 1945 became a crucible of extraordinary creativity as they sought new languages to make sense of a world transformed by war, economic collapse, and the unsettling promise of modernity. In the United States, the neighborhood of Harlem in New York City became an unlikely center of poetic innovation. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans northward from the rural South, carrying with them musical traditions, storytelling practices, and a determination to claim their place in American cultural life. The Harlem Renaissance that emerged in the 1920s saw poets drawing from blues rhythms, jazz improvisation, and the cadences of sermon and song to create something entirely new in American verse. Langston Hughes became perhaps the most prominent voice of this movement, though he was far from alone. His poems carried the syncopated rhythms of the music that filled Harlem's nightclubs, and he wrote in a language that honored the speech of ordinary people rather than imitating European conventions. When Hughes asked what happens to a dream deferred, whether it dries up like a raisin in the sun or explodes, he was posing questions that reached far beyond poetry into the heart of American experience. County Cullen, Claude McKay, and Jean Toomer added their own distinct voices to this flowering, creating a body of work that insisted on the richness and complexity of Black life in America. Across the Atlantic, Europe was processing its own trauma. The First World War had shattered assumptions about progress and civilization, and poets found themselves writing in a landscape, both literal and metaphorical, that had been devastated. W.H. Auden emerged in England during the 1930s as a voice capable of combining technical mastery with contemporary urgency. His poems ranged from intimate personal reflections to sweeping statements about the age, always marked by an intelligence that could be both compassionate and unflinching. Auden's generation watched the rise of fascism with growing alarm, and their poetry reflected the political tensions of the time without abandoning the craft and musicality that made verse memorable. In Spain, a remarkable group of poets known as the Generation of 27 brought new life to Spanish verse by combining ancient traditions with modern sensibilities. Federico Garcia Lorca wrote poems that drew from Andalusian folk songs and flamenco rhythms, while incorporating surrealist imagery and profound emotional depth. His poetry celebrated his native Granada, explored themes of desire and identity, and used symbols like the moon and the color green in ways that felt both timeless and startlingly contemporary. The Spanish Civil War would claim Lorca's life in 1936, a tragedy that silenced one of the era's most distinctive voices. Meanwhile, in Latin America, poetry was experiencing its own remarkable renaissance. Pablo Neruda of Chile began writing love poems of extraordinary sensuality, and later turned to more politically engaged work as he witnessed the struggles of working people and indigenous communities. His poetry could be tender or angry, intimate or sweeping in scope, always marked by a gift for metaphor that connected human emotion to the natural world. In the Caribbean, poets were beginning to write in new ways about colonial experience and the complex cultural identities of island nations. The Surrealist movement, which had begun in France in the 1920s, offered poets another path forward. Building on the experimental spirit of the Dadaists, Surrealist poets like André Breton and Paul Éluard sought to access the unconscious mind through automatic writing and dreamlike imagery. They believed that by bypassing rational thought, poetry could reveal deeper truths about human experience. The Surrealists' influence spread internationally, affecting poets from Latin America to Eastern Europe who adapted its techniques to their own cultural contexts. In Ireland, W.B. Yeats continued the work he had begun in the previous century, but his poetry of this period took on new gravity. The Irish War of Independence and the Civil War that followed gave his verse an elegiac quality as he meditated on violence, political change, and the passage of time. His later poems achieved a remarkable directness and power, stripping away some of the elaborate symbolism of his youth while retaining an unmistakable musicality. Eastern Europe produced poets who wrote in the shadow of competing empires and ideologies. In Poland, writers like Czesław Miłosz were coming of age in a nation that had only recently regained independence after more than a century of partition. In Russia, poets navigated the demands and dangers of the Soviet system. Anna Akhmatova witnessed the execution of her husband and the imprisonment of her son, and her poetry bore witness to these traumas with controlled intensity. Osip Mandelstam's brilliant, elusive poems ultimately led to his death in a Soviet labor camp, a reminder of poetry's power and the threat it could pose to authoritarian regimes. As the 1930s progressed and war seemed increasingly inevitable, poets found themselves writing with a sense of urgency. Some engaged directly with political themes, while others focused on preserving beauty and human connection in a darkening world. The Spanish Civil War, in particular, drew poets from many nations who saw it as a crucial battle between democracy and fascism. Auden, Stephen Spender, and others traveled to Spain, and their poems reflected both their hopes for the Republican cause and their growing understanding of war's complexity and cost. Throughout these decades, poetry continued to serve its ancient functions, even as it adapted to modern circumstances. Poets still celebrated love and mourned loss, still found meaning in nature, and struggled with questions of mortality. But they did so in a world where airplanes crossed oceans, where cities sprawled ever larger, where radio brought distant voices into homes, and where the next war promised destruction on an unprecedented scale. The poetry written between these two conflicts captured the tension of a world in flux, the anxiety of uncertain times, and the enduring human need to make meaning through language. As the Second World War finally began in 1939, poets once again found themselves called to bear witness, to resist, to remember, and to imagine a future beyond the immediate catastrophe. The years between the wars had prepared them, in some measure, for this task, having taught them to write with both technical skill and moral clarity, to honor tradition while embracing innovation, and to believe in poetry's continuing relevance even in the darkest times. As the world emerged from the devastation of global conflict, poetry found itself at a crossroads. The certainties that had once anchored verse to tradition had been shaken, and poets in the post-war years began exploring territories of human experience that had previously remained unspoken or hidden behind careful literary conventions. In the quiet suburbs of 1950s America, a young poet named Robert Lowell sat in his study, writing verses that would shock the literary establishment. Lowell had inherited a tradition of measured, formal poetry, but something within him demanded a different kind of honesty. His collection, Life Studies, published in 1959, broke open the doors of poetic propriety. Here were poems about mental hospitals, family dysfunction, and personal breakdown, written with an intimacy that made readers feel as though they were reading someone's private diary. This approach became known as confessional poetry, and it transformed what poets felt they could reveal about their inner lives. Sylvia Plath carried this confessional impulse even further in her searing verses written during the early 1960s. Her poems combined technical precision with raw emotional power, addressing themes of identity, creativity, and despair with an intensity that seemed to burn through the page. She crafted her lines with careful attention to sound and rhythm, even as she explored the darkest corners of human consciousness. Her contemporary, Anne Sexton, wrote with similar courage about experiences that had been considered too personal or too painful for poetry. Across the ocean, in post-war England, Philip Larkin was developing a very different voice. His poems spoke in the tones of ordinary conversation, finding poetry in railway stations, office buildings, and provincial towns. Larkin's verse combined accessibility with profound observation, capturing the quiet disappointments and small beauties of everyday life. His poems move through the world without grand gestures, observing how people actually lived rather than how they might ideally exist. Meanwhile, on the American West Coast, something entirely different was brewing. In the coffee houses and small galleries of San Francisco, a group of poets was creating work that rejected the academic refinement that dominated university poetry departments. Allen Ginsberg's Howl, first performed in 1955 at the Six Gallery, announced the arrival of the beat movement with electric force. The poem rushed forward in long, breathless lines that seemed to capture the rhythm of jazz music and the energy of a generation questioning everything their parents had accepted. Ginsberg and his contemporaries, Jack Kerouac, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Gary Snyder, brought poetry back into performance spaces, reading their work aloud to audiences hungry for new forms of expression. The beats drew inspiration from Walt Whitman's expansive spirit and from Eastern philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism. They sought spontaneity, directness, and a breaking down of the barriers between art and life. Their poems celebrated wandering, questioning, and experiences outside mainstream culture. While critics initially dismissed their work as undisciplined, the Beats demonstrated that poetry could reach audiences far beyond university classrooms and literary journals. In the midst of these experimental movements, Elizabeth Bishop was quietly crafting poems of extraordinary precision and depth. Bishop traveled widely, living in Brazil for many years, and her poems observed the world with a painter's eye for detail. She wrote about geography, animals, and ordinary objects, finding within them profound questions about seeing, knowing, and belonging. Her work demonstrated that careful craftsmanship and emotional resonance need not be at odds. The Black Arts movement of the 1960s brought poetry directly into the struggle for civil rights and cultural identity. Poets like Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, and Nikki Giovanni created work that spoke powerfully about the African American experience, drawing on jazz rhythms, blues traditions, and the language of the streets. These poets saw their work as inseparable from political and social transformation, using verse to celebrate Black culture and challenge injustice. During these same decades, poets in Latin America were creating masterworks that would reach worldwide audiences. Pablo Neruda's Cien Sonetos de Amor demonstrated how traditional forms could carry contemporary passion. Octavio Paz explored language itself as a subject for poetry, examining how words create and limit our understanding of reality. These poets reminded the English-speaking world that profound poetic innovation was happening in many languages across the globe. The 1970s saw poetry continuing to diversify and experiment. The New York School poets, including John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, brought painterly approaches to verse, creating poems that valued association and surprise over logical development. Their work often felt like walking through a modern art gallery, where unexpected juxtapositions created new ways of seeing. Women poets continued expanding the boundaries of what poetry could address. Adrienne Rich moved from formal verse to increasingly political poetry, examining power, gender, and language itself. Audre Lorde brought together multiple identities in her work, refusing to separate her experiences as a Black woman, mother, and activist. These poets insisted that the personal was indeed political, and that poetry had a role to play in social transformation. Meanwhile, poets were also finding new ways to work within traditional forms. Richard Wilbur and Anthony Hecht demonstrated that rhyme and meter still offered possibilities for contemporary expression. Their carefully crafted poems proved that formal poetry could address modern experience without sounding antiquated or artificial. As the 20th century moved into its final decades, poetry had become remarkably diverse. There was no single dominant movement or style. Instead, poets worked in multiple traditions simultaneously, some writing free verse, while others explored traditional forms, some performing for audiences, while others crafted quiet lyrics for the page. This plurality reflected poetry's essential vitality. The art form that had begun with humanity's first songs remained endlessly adaptable, capable of capturing each generation's unique vision and voice. The post-war years had taught poetry an important lesson, that there was room for many approaches, many voices, many truths, whether confessional or observational, political or personal, formal or free. poetry continued doing what it had always done, giving shape to human experience through the mysterious alchemy of carefully chosen words. As the 20th century drew to its close and a new millennium dawned, poetry found itself in a remarkable state of transformation. The ancient art that had begun around campfires and in temple courtyards was now spreading through coffee shops, digital screens, and urban stages, reaching audiences in ways its earliest practitioners could never have imagined. The performance poetry movement that had been gathering momentum since the 1980s exploded into mainstream consciousness in the 1990s. In Chicago, a construction worker named Mark Smith had created something called a poetry slam in 1984, transforming poetry from a quiet, page-bound experience into a competitive performance art. The concept spread like wildfire across American cities and then around the world. These slams brought poetry into bars, community centers, and theaters, where poets stood before live audiences and delivered their words with the full force of their voices, their bodies, and their presence. The rules of slam poetry were elegantly simple. Poets had 3 minutes to perform original work without props or costumes. Judges selected from the audience scored each performance, and the competitive element drew crowds who might never have picked up a poetry anthology. But beneath the competition lay something profound, a return to poetry's earliest roots as a living, breathing art, meant to be heard rather than silently read. Poets like Patricia Smith, Saul Williams, and Taylor Marley became masters of this form, crafting verses that worked both on the page and in performance. Their poems tackled contemporary issues with urgency and passion, addressing race, identity, love, social justice, and the everyday struggles of modern life. The language was often conversational, accessible, drawing from hip-hop, everyday speech, and various cultural traditions. This accessibility brought poetry to communities that had felt excluded from academic literary culture. Alongside slam poetry, the broader spoken word movement encompassed poets who performed their work without the competitive element. Performance poets created pieces specifically designed for the voice, using repetition, rhythm, and dynamics in ways that recalled the ancient bards and griots. The Last Poets and Gil Scott-Heron had pioneered this fusion of poetry and performance in the 1990s, and their influence rippled forward into the new century. Meanwhile, on the page, contemporary poets were exploring an astonishing range of styles and approaches. Some embraced traditional forms, writing sonnets and villanelles with fresh contemporary voices. Others experimented with language itself, creating visual poetry where words scattered across pages in meaningful patterns, or conceptual poetry that challenged basic assumptions about authorship and originality. The American poet Billy Collins served as poet laureate and became widely beloved for accessible verse that found profound meaning in everyday moments. Forgetting names, observing dogs, remembering childhood. His success demonstrated that contemporary poetry need not be obscure or difficult to find a substantial readership. Other poets worked in very different directions. Louise Gluck crafted stark, powerful poems, drawing on mythology and personal experience, her crystalline language creating moments of devastating clarity. Rita Dove brought historical narratives to life, exploring her African-American heritage through various forms and voices. Ocean Vuong, arriving in America as a refugee from Vietnam, created shimmering poems that bridged cultures and languages, his work embracing both beauty and difficult truths. The internet opened entirely new possibilities for poetry's distribution and creation. Poets started blogs, shared work through social media, and found audiences scattered across the globe. Some poets built substantial followings on platforms like Tumblr and Instagram, where their words appeared alongside images, reaching readers who scrolled through their phones late at night. Rupi Kaur became a publishing phenomenon with short, accessible poems shared online before being collected in best-selling books, though literary critics debated whether her simplified style represented democracy or diminishment. Digital platforms also enabled new forms of collaboration. Poets could now write together across continents, responding to each other's work in real time. Poetry could incorporate hyperlinks, multimedia elements, and interactive features that transformed the reader's experience. Some poets created works specifically for digital spaces, where the screen itself became part of the poem's meaning. The definition of what constituted poetry continued to expand. Hip-hop artists were increasingly recognized as poets. Their complex wordplay, metaphors, and social commentary, placing them in direct lineage with earlier poetic traditions. The lyrics of rappers like Kendrick Lamar and No Name demonstrated sophisticated literary techniques while remaining grounded in specific communities and experiences. Poetry therapy and writing workshops flourished, helping people process trauma, find their voices, and connect with others through creative expression. Hospitals, prisons, schools, and community centers hosted poetry programs, recognizing the art form's power to heal and transform. The practice of writing poetry became as valued as reading it, with countless individuals finding solace and strength in arranging their own words into meaningful patterns. Translation also entered a golden age, with contemporary translators working to bring poetry from around the world into English and other languages. Readers could now access work by poets from every continent, discovering voices shaped by experiences far from their own. This global exchange enriched all poetry, as traditions that had developed separately for centuries now influenced and inspired each other. Contemporary poets wrote about technology, climate change, pandemic isolation, and social movements, proving that poetry remained responsive to the present moment. They wrote about immigration, about gender and sexuality, about grief and joy, about the ordinary magic of washing dishes or watching birds. No subject was too large or too small for poetic attention. Academic poetry and popular poetry sometimes existed in tension, with debates about accessibility, complexity, and what poetry should accomplish. Yet this very diversity suggested poetry's continued vitality. There was room for difficult experimental work and for simple, heartfelt verses, for ancient forms and new inventions, for poetry on the page and poetry shouted from stages. As our long journey through poetry's history reaches this present moment, we find the art as alive as ever. Young people fill venues for poetry slams, their voices rising with the same passion that moved the first singers. Elderly poets continue refining their craft after decades of practice. Children discover the joy of rhyme and rhythm in classrooms and bedrooms. Poetry adapts, transforms, and endures. The story of poetry is not finished. of course. It continues tonight, tomorrow, and into futures we cannot yet imagine. As long as humans seek to capture meaning in carefully chosen words, as long as we feel the need to give shape to our deepest experiences through language, poetry will persist. From the first songs of humanity to whatever forms await in centuries to come, poetry remains what it has always been. Our oldest and newest way of saying what matters most, of making music from words, of reaching across the spaces between us to touch another mind, another heart, another human being traveling briefly through this mysterious world. As we bring to a close our journey through the timeless art of poetry, from ancient epics that echoed through civilizations to the passionate spoken word of today, we hope these gentle reflections on language and human expression have carried you peacefully through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this quiet exploration of how poets have shaped our words, our cultures, and our souls across the centuries. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers discover these restful stories. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles into stillness, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.